Hi, welcome back to Intertextuality. This is part 6. Today's episode is going to be kind of different because I'm not going to be doing the classic thing where I'm looking at around 10 examples of the Quranic interaction with Judeo-Christian tradition. Rather, I'm going to be taking a story, the story of Joseph in the Quran, and comparing it with the Genesis account in the Bible. And just sort of taking a deeper look and seeing, okay, well, how does the Quran, on a deeper level, just looking at one story, right? Well, how does it engage with the text? And so we're going to find some connections, but they're going to be a little bit more subtle, right? And so we've seen a lot of things in this series. We've seen intertextuality when it comes to the details of a text, hidden things in a text, small examples here and there. We've seen it when it comes to stories. We've seen it when it comes to the interpretations of stories. And so we've seen a lot of different types of interaction. And so I thought it'd be interesting to look at how the Quran interacts with a story, again, on a much deeper level and actually going into the details of the text and this and that. And so we've done some similar things like this before when we compare stories, but this is going to be a little bit different in that we're looking at the same account in Genesis from beginning to end, and then we're looking at the same account in the Quran from beginning to end. So we're going to find some intertextuality connections, but we're also going to find differences, and so it's going to be interesting to compare how the stories are told in both versions and how sort of the Quran interacts with the Genesis story and how it's playing on the Genesis story of Joseph. And so this is sort of a whole another different layer and a different dimension to the sort of intertextuality that's going on. So again, the text we're looking at is Surah Yusuf, that's quote-unquote chapter 12 in the Quran. That's basically the only place where the story of Joseph is mentioned in the Quran. It really is the only place. Joseph is mentioned a couple other times, a few other times, but the only time where a story is given is in this chapter, and that's actually quite unique for the Quran. And then we're going to be looking at Genesis account. But just to refresh your memory of sort of the argument we're making, and by the way, I will say that last episode we looked at the Jesus connections and the Christianity connections. Now, for Intertextuality 7, I'm actually going to show you academics themselves admitting and agreeing that Christians did not live in Mecca at that time. Okay, and so they were not Christians. And so if you have any doubt that somehow the Christianity and this and that was floating around in Mecca at that time, of course that's a ridiculous premise in the first place, because we have a whole nation's testimony which says no, and we know it's authentic testimony. But I'll show you Orientalists admitting it as well. So that's going to be in the beginning of the next episode as well. And so that sort of even further strengthens last week's argument where we were looking at the connections with Christian literature. But again, just to refresh, basically what we're doing in this series, we're looking at the fact that the Prophet Muhammad could not read or write. In fact, the Arabs as a whole could not read or write. This is established historically. Looking at the fact that the Quran yet will have sort of intertextuality and interact with untranslated or lost texts. We'll even correct these texts, these Judeo-Christian texts, mostly, right? Also the fact that we talked about the fact that the Prophet Muhammad is sincere. We gave many examples. For example, the fact that he used to cry in his prayer for hours, and he used to sort of pray for hours, and he used to cry a lot during those prayers. That is a sign of sincerity. Talked about the fact that the Meccans did not know these stories in Mecca, which was the city of the Prophet. Even the basics of these stories were not known. Talked about the fact that if he was being taught by someone, some people would have noticed, because people who were around him 24/7, they were noticing what he was doing. Again, the fact that most of these stories were already revealed in Mecca, where there were no Jews and Christians. Yes, after the Prophet migrated to Medina, there were Jews, but at that point, most of the stories had been revealed already. And so even in the sort of the surahs that are revealed in Medina, a lot of the stories that are told are actually already in Quran in Mecca, so they're told again in the Quran in Medina. Not every story, but many of them. But here you can see most of them already told in Mecca. And even in Medina, if he was learning from someone, people would have noticed, because there were even more people around him in Medina, right? So someone would have noticed and they would call him out. Even in Mecca, when the Meccans tried and accused a specific man of teaching him, they couldn't point to a rabbi teaching him, they couldn't point to a priest, because they weren't Jews and Christians in Mecca. All they could point to was a slave of someone who couldn't even speak Arabic. So it was such a ridiculous claim, because he couldn't even speak Arabic. How is he going to teach the Prophet, peace be upon him? So also I mentioned the fact that the Bible, just like the extra biblical material, are all traditions. This isn't like the genuine pure word of God or anything. It's got mistakes, it's got problems, it's got historical inaccuracies. So the Bible, just like the extra biblical material, is both truth and falsehood, right? And this is important to mention, because some Christian missionaries and this and that will say, oh, if the Quran mentions anything from the Bible, it's accurate historically. But if it mentions anything from outside the Bible, extra biblical material, that's a sort of a quote-unquote myth in the Quran. And so the problem is they're beginning with the assumption that the Bible itself is completely accurate as well, whereas the reality is the Bible, just like those extra biblical materials, has truth and has falsehood. So the Bible is a tradition just like those other books. And I proved this in the first episode. I'll give you another I'll give you another example through which we know this. The fact that there are contradictions. For example, in Exodus it mentions Abraham knows the Tetragrammaton, the name Yahweh, Wavhe, but in Genesis, according to Exodus, Abraham does not know the name, but in Genesis he knows the name. And so that shows that there are contradictions, so this is not the pristine word of God either. So everything is a tradition. So anyway, with keeping in mind that there were no Jews and Christians in Mecca, that the Arabs didn't even know the basics of these stories, the Prophet was sincere, he couldn't read or write, the Arabs as a whole couldn't read or write, this and that. If he was being taught by someone, we would have noticed, and this and that. All this shows us is that the Prophet could not be knowing these Judeo-Christian traditions. Yet in the Quran we have so much interaction with Judeo-Christian traditions, which shows us that the author is extremely knowledgeable about Judeo-Christian tradition. He's more than just a scholar, he's an extreme scholar of the Judeo-Christian traditions. And he will even correct them from the point of view of history, right? Like correcting historical mistakes that were not known at the time. And that is a sign that Prophet Muhammad did not author this, rather this is coming directly from God himself. And of course, if you go to my linguistic studies video, I refute the idea that there were other people, or there were other ways through which the Quran, or other potential authors of the Quran as well. Like some other sources, or this and that. As in the idea that, okay, fine, maybe Muhammad himself didn't make it up, but he got it from somewhere else. I refuted those as well. And of course, even in this video, that wouldn't make sense. If you go to part 2, I talk about some historical accuracies in the Quran, with the Quran correcting the Bible historically. And that doesn't make sense unless it's from God, because no one would know those are historical errors at that time, because they weren't known to be historical errors at the time, and there are many other reasons through which we can talk about how we know those other arguments are wrong. The point is, the Quran is extreme knowledge of Judeo-Christian tradition, whereas there's no way Prophet Muhammad had access to these things, and he was sincere, so he wouldn't even want to go ahead and lie and pretend and this and that. So the fact that despite all this, despite the circumstances of the Prophet, peace be upon him, the Quran still has such extreme knowledge of the Judeo-Christian traditions, this is a sign that it is from God himself. So with that in mind, let's go into the video today. First thing I'll mention is why Surah Yusuf was revealed. Why was the story of Joseph revealed in the Quran? Well, there are a few reasons of revelation. One of the reasons of revelation is because the Jews demanded it. So basically the Arabs, the Meccan Arabs, they were like, okay, Muhammad is saying he's a prophet. Let us go to Medina, where we know that Jews exist. Okay, we know Jews exist, and we know they have a book with them. So let's go ahead and ask them, how do we sort of deal with this prophet? How do we know if he's true or not? So how do we test this prophet? So they went near there, and they asked the Jews, well, what do we do? right? And this, again, the Jews lived very, very far away from Mecca at the time. But they sent a delegation to Medina. Yathrib is the other name of Medina, so they went all the way, traveled all the way to the nearest Jewish community they could find and asked them, well, how do we deal with this? And the Jews said, okay, well, this is how you can test if he's a true prophet or not. Ask him about the story of Joseph and his brothers. Okay, and if he tells you the story of Joseph and his brothers, then he is a true prophet. Okay, and then you should obey him. So ask him if he truly is a prophet to tell you what happened with Joseph and his brothers, because nobody knows this of your people. This is something we know. So the Yahud, the Jews, lived far away in Medina. Yathrib is Medina. So how would anybody in Mecca know the story of Joseph and his brothers? So the Jews themselves acknowledged, okay, there's no way the people in Mecca know the story of Joseph and his brothers. Only we here, the Jews in Medina, we're basically the only Jews in Arabia. We're the only people with knowledge of the scripture in Arabia, right? The only one other than us are north, very, very far away, billions of times farther away than the Jews were some Christian communities very, very north of Arabia. But basically, the Jews acknowledged we're basically the only community of people with the book in Arabia. Oh, so only we know the story of Joseph and his brothers. There's no way that you living in Mecca know the story, so test him by asking him of this story, and if he's a true prophet, he'll know it. If he's a false prophet, he won't. Right? So the Quraysh went back to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and asked him, tell us the story of Joseph and his brothers if you are a true prophet. Allah answered that question and revealed Surah Yusuf. Okay. In one of the last verses of the surah, Allah says, this is of the ilm al-ghayb that we send down to you. Okay. In Surah Yusuf, Allah is telling the Prophet that He is giving them ilm al-ghayb. So ilm al-ghayb is knowledge of the unseen, and His people did not know the story until this surah came down to them. This is actually another evidence that the Meccans did not know the story. The fact that the Quran mentions they didn't know it. Right? نحن نقص عليك أحسن القصص بما أوهينا إليك هذا القرآن وإن كنت من قبله لمن الغافلين. We relate to you, being addressed to the Prophet, because it's in the singular. You is in the singular in Arabic. So we relate to you the best of stories through our revelation of this Quran, though before this you were of the unaware. So لمن الغافلين actually means from amongst the unaware. So the Quran mentions the fact that the Arabs did not know the story as well. And usually historians will accept Quranic testimony for what was actually going around along in Arabia at that time, right? Simply because if Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was reciting these signs, these verses, or actually the correct translation is these signs in public, right? And in reality, they did know these stories. People would have called out. No one would have believed in him. It would have been ridiculous, right? But the fact that the Quran mentions they didn't know it, and these revelations were public, and no one protested and said, actually, we do know it, that's actually a proof that they did not know these stories. So notice how just knowing the story is enough proof. It's enough proof that he's a prophet. Yet we find even more interaction, and we found it throughout this series. We've not just looked at we've looked at some stories, but we've really in this series been looking at things much deeper than just stories, right? We've been looking at much deeper examples. And I'll mention at the end of this series some of the stories that are mentioned in the Quran, which are in Judeo-Christian literature. But basically the examples we've looked at are not stories. They are more deeper examples, right? Than even that. Yet just knowing the stories by itself would be enough to prove he's a prophet. So with that in mind, let us get into the interactions. Number one, I mentioned this before, the Surah Yusuf continues the tradition of wordplay with the name Yusuf. So Yusuf is the name of Joseph in both Hebrew and Arabic. So the Quran continues the Bible's tradition of having wordplays on the name Yusuf. And it also continues the tradition of sort of hinting in the beginning of the story that Joseph is like a sheep, right? So according to Saqib Hussein, there is wordplay on the name of Joseph several times in the Genesis story. And in the Quran, we find this as well. So, in the Quran, Allah says, وَتَوَلَّى عَنْهُمْ وَقَالَ يَا أَسَفَ عَلَى يُوسُف. And he turned away from them and he said, "Oh, my sorrow over Joseph." If you look at the Arabic, you find a pun. Ya asafa is very similar to Yusuf. Yusuf, ya asafa. So there's a pun here with the name Joseph. And this is continuing actually a biblical tradition. We find the book of Genesis doing the same thing. So this is very interesting that the book of Genesis has this characteristic quality of it when it comes to the story of Joseph, that it will wordplay on his name. And the Quran ends up continuing that tradition as well, which shows you a much greater familiarity with the Genesis text. So for example, Genesis 37:5, Yusifu, the P here is actually pronounced F, so you can look up a recitation, it's pronounced F. Yusuf, Yusifu, right? Even here you can see Yusuf is with a P, so Yusifu, right? So you can see Genesis 37:5 uses this word which is similar to Yusuf, so there's that pun there. Also in Genesis 37:8 you find again Yusifu, the same pun. And this website you can go if you want to hear the recitation. Also Genesis 42:17 mentions Wa'i Yusuf. So he put Yusuf, the same thing, the same pun again. So we find it is here's a commentary confirming there's it forms a wordplay on the name Joseph. So there's a commentary confirming. So the point is, Genesis as a text a few times will actually play on the name of Joseph. So it'll do this characteristic wordplay the author is intentionally doing, and then the Quran does the same thing as well. Ya asafa ala Yusuf. Oh, my sorrow over Yusuf in the Quran. The next thing is Genesis 49:33 portrays Joseph a little bit, hints to him as being a sheep, right? So, and when he had finished, Jacob commanding his sons, then he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. Oh, actually, this is another wordplay, where Yusuf. So this is not the sheep thing. This is the wordplay, where Yusuf. So that's another wordplay in the story of Joseph. This actually goes towards now the end of the story of Joseph, where now Jacob is on the deathbed and this and that in Genesis 49. That's another example of the wordplay. But now, coming to the sheep example, the Quran mentions that the brothers of Joseph say to the father, أَرْسِلْهُ مَعَنَا غَدًا يَرْتَعْ وَيَلْعَبْ وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. Send him out with us tomorrow so that he may enjoy himself and play, and we will really watch over him. The word here, yarta, which means play, also can mean to pasture, to graze, like a sheep would. Here you can see the meanings. So there's almost a hint in the Quran that this specific word has been chosen by the author, and yes, it can mean things like enjoy and this and that, but also it means to pasture, to graze. So there's sort of a hint in the language to Joseph being portrayed as this sheep that is grazing. And Genesis does the same thing. Genesis 37:15, and found him a certain man, and there he was wandering in the field, and asked him the man, saying, what? And whatever. So the word here, wandering, is toe. And you'll see ta is the word for cause to wander about, and it's accusative of people as sheep. Accusative of people as sheep. And interestingly, look how it's mentioned ta. The word here is ta, toe, ta. The word in the Quran also forms a wordplay. Yarta, ta. So here it's toe, or here it's ta. In the Quran, yarta. So that's another wordplay, the Quran. So that's deep interaction with the Genesis text on a very deep detail level, right? So like innocent sheep in trouble in Genesis story mindset. So that means in the story, the mindset, in the Genesis story, the mindset of Joseph that's being portrayed here is that he's like an innocent sheep. He doesn't know what's about to happen to him. Of course, his brothers are going to throw him in the well and whatnot. Interestingly, Christians would associate Joseph being the sheep like Jesus is the sheep. And they would try and basically say where Jesus is the lamb, so he's like the sheep. And so the Christians would actually play on this idea of this wordplay. or this sort of portrayal of Joseph as a sheep, and they would say, well, it's foreshadowing Jesus to come, who's going to be like a lamb, right? This is according to Saqib Hussein. Why did Joseph think of a wolf? This is interesting. Maybe he's shooting back at them based on their hint of portraying Joseph as a lamb. So, interestingly, in the Quran, Joseph then says, after they say, send him with us and this and that, Joseph says, it would truly sadden me. He responded, it would truly sadden me if you took him away with you, and I fear that a wolf may devour him while you are negligent of him. So why is he saying wolf? Why is he saying a wolf might gather him? It could be that Joseph picked up the hint of them sort of portraying him as a sheep, and because Joseph previously in the story is already sort of suspicious of him, he shoots back. He's like, oh, you're portraying him as a sheep? Well, you know, I'll hit back at you with the idea that you're like a wolves, right? Looking to prey on the sheep. And we know that Joseph was suspicious because verse 5, Joseph says to, Jacob. I keep saying Joseph here. I mean Jacob the father. So Jacob the father is the one who says, who's saying to them, I fear a wolf might devour you. So Jacob the father previously tells Joseph the son in the story, oh my dear son, do not relate your vision to your brothers or they will devise a plot against you. Surely Satan is a sworn enemy to humankind. So we know Jacob is suspicious of the brothers already. So here you can see the interesting wordplay, da and yarta. The other connection with the Genesis story is the fact that in both Genesis and in Surah Yusuf, we find religious tones being used in a secular way. Basically what that means is, if you read through Genesis, you find, for example, many dreams happening. So there are a lot of dreams that happen in Genesis. So Abraham has dreams with God. Jacob himself, so Jacob again is the father of Joseph. So Jacob in his stories in Genesis has dreams with God. But in all these dreams, what's happening is that God himself is there. And he's talking himself to the prophet. Right? But the story of Joseph, in the story of Joseph, Joseph has dreams which are very different. What ends up happening is God is absent suddenly in the dream in this story. So God is suddenly absent in the dreams in the story of Joseph. They're about other things. God is not there. They're about sun and the moon and the stars and this and that. No God. Right? Whereas God always shows up in dreams beforehand. The God is absent suddenly in the dream in this story, and even the dreams Joseph interprets later, he's absent. So later on there are more dreams and God again doesn't show up. So this is sort of in the story of Joseph where we find is suddenly God is absent. So it's sort of the classic religious idea that's presented in Genesis of dreams being like these religious things that are very much associated with God and this and that, but suddenly when we come to the story of Joseph, God is absent from the dreams. So it's religious tones used in a secular way. Interestingly, the Quranic story is different as well, in that this is the one story in the Quran, or at least one of the rare stories in the Quran, told about a prophet where the emphasis is not on Tawheed, but rather it's on other themes. So usually when Allah tells stories in the Quran, the whole point of that is Allah is saying, okay, I sent a prophet to these people, they preached to them to believe in me, believe in one God and this and that, they didn't obey me, so I destroyed them. Or it's something about how Moses was telling the Israelites to obey and this and that, but then they took the calf for worship. They didn't believe in one God alone. They took the calf for worship. They did many sins and this and that. So all about obedience to God and this and that. Stories of Jesus in the Quran. What's the point? One of the main points is to clear up Jesus was not part of a trinity. He was not God and this and that. He was just a messenger of God, and he preached monotheism and this and that. So over and over, this is what the Quranic stories are all about. Believe in one God, believe in one God. These previous nations, they didn't believe, so I destroyed them and this and that. But the story of Joseph is different. This is the one prophet that we find a story of him in the Quran, but it's completely different. There is a sermon of monotheism. There are like 5 verses in the middle where Joseph gives them a speech on monotheism, but most of the story is not about that. It's about patience and endurance and having trust in God and going through hard times and this and that. So it's a very different story in the Quran. So unlike with the other prophets, how when the goal is mostly basically almost always monotheism, and they didn't believe, so I destroyed them. This is the theme of the stories over and over again. This is a unique story. This is a different story in the Quran, and that's not really the main issue that is brought up. So again, just like in Genesis, how God suddenly is absent from the dreams, this story suddenly, again, it's sort of a religious tones in a more secular way. Sort of God again and monotheism again are not the focus of the story. Rather, it's the story is more about patience and trusting in God and this and that, right? It's not about God sending a messenger, them disbelieving and destroying, right? It's less about that. It's more about patience and hardship and again trust in God and these types of things and the difficulties that you go through in life. So it's similar in that suddenly it's a different type of story in the Quran, one which is less about the monotheism and this and that. Just like how in we have these same themes in Genesis where God is suddenly absent from the dreams. And again, the dreams being characteristic of God in Genesis. So here's, for example, a dream, Abraham's dream in the Bible, and you see the Lord is the one who appears to him. Here again, you can see the Lord is the one who appears to him. Here again, in Jacob's dream, you see the Lord is the one who appears to Jacob. Stood the Lord, meaning God. But here, later, you can see in the stories, when it comes to Joseph's dream, there's no God. It's about the three branches and the wine and the vine and the grapes and the baskets of bread and this and that and the Pharaoh and whatnot. So very different, very different. Very similar to how the Quran is telling a different type of story, one which is less focused on the monotheism, and it's sort of the unique story. It's more just about the life and biography of Joseph instead of being just about believe in God and if you don't, we'll destroy you, and all those classic themes that are brought up many times in the warnings in the Quran and this and that. Even if you think about the whole main dream, there's a prostration to a man. So if you look at the main dream in the story, and in the story in Genesis there are two of these dreams. What happens is that they're about prostrations to men. So the 11 stars and the sun and the moon are prostrating to essentially Joseph in the dream. That's different. That's different in the Quran, and that's different in Genesis. In that this again is a sort of a religious idea of prostrating to someone. But again, in both Genesis and the Quran, this religious idea of prostrating to God is taken and then applied in this dream to a man. Right? That instead of prostrating to God, man is the one who's being prostrated to in the story. And I've, of course, discussed in a previous Intertextuality, I think it was Intertextuality 2, why the Quran does this. And of course, we know that, in previous nations, there was this concept of prostrating to others in terms of respect and this and that. That's why you have in the Bible, for example, people prostrate to Daniel as well. You do find these prostrations to, I think, David as well. Even the story of prostrating to Joseph and this and that. So these were allowed in certain previous nations, but it is still a different thing. That usually prostration, this and that, is linked with God. But yet here, it's a little bit more secular, even though it does have precedent in both the Quran. Both the Quran talks about the story of the angels bowing to Adam, and in the Bible you have these examples. But it is still less associated with man, and it's mostly associated with God, right? So it is a religious thing being talked about in a secular way. So here you can see the same thing in the Genesis story. There's bowing down to man, right? So what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous, but his father kept the matter in mind. Okay, so interesting that Allah too is subtle in the Quran. The word for bless appears in the beginning of the story, and the Lord shows up in Genesis 39, beginning and end, by the narrator. But Genesis 39, by the narrator so I think it's brought up twice in Genesis 39, the Lord. Then both disappear till the end of the story. Not in Genesis 41, for example, when you'd expect. When he gets the Pharaoh role, no mention of the Lord. So basically, what this is talking about is the fact that even in the Genesis story, God is suddenly absent. He's not brought up as much in the story. Right, so he's brought up in the beginning and in the end, and he's brought up a couple times in Genesis 39, but then God disappears from the story until the end in Genesis. And Genesis 41 is actually a perfect time when you'd expect the Lord to show up, because Joseph actually gets a higher role in Egypt under the Pharaoh, so you would expect it to say something like the Lord provided this for him, and when he goes into to the prison and this and that, that's Genesis 39. That's when that's when the Lord is brought up twice. The Lord is mentioned twice, but then suddenly in Genesis 41 the Lord is absent. He's not mentioned by the narrator. And so that's another example of the Genesis story sort of taking these religious tones and showing it in a more secular way. That, you know, this story is a little bit, God is a little bit less mentioned in this story. And the Quran is the same thing. God is mentioned less in this story, right? And the sort of the main themes of the story are Joseph and his life and this and that. And God is brought up many, many times in terms of, like, many of the things do relate back to God, but it's not as direct. It's a little bit more subtle in the Quran, right? For example, the story of Joseph and the woman who tried to seduce him, God is brought up in that. But again, it's a little bit more subtle, whereas the rest of the Quran, it's a lot more direct. When these stories are told, it's a lot more direct. The messenger saying, I'm a messenger from God to you. If you don't believe you're going to get destroyed, then God destroys him, this and that. A lot more direct, but in the story of Joseph, more subtle, more God is brought up, but it's more through a lot of the narrative that's going on, right? It's less in your face. Even the trusting in God, again, that's more subtle idea of God being there. So the Quran, again, very similar in that this is a story that suddenly God is brought up less. So it's, again, religious tones in a more secular way. Okay. What is this about? Right. So here we have so these are the mentions of God in the Quran, in this story. These some of the mentions of God in this story, but you'll notice, again, brought up less than in other stories. So here, indeed, my Lord is subtle in fulfilling what he wills. You know, my Lord has made it come true. Surely he alone is the all-knowing, all-aware. Here we find, and Allah is dominant over his affairs, but most of the people do not know, and this and that. So I'm going to explain what the point of all this is. Here Joseph says, when the woman tries to seduce him, Allah is my refuge. And so here he says, here he then gives them a sermon. The prisoners a sermon that's basically to believe in God and this and that. This is interesting. So before 41, he sort of gives a sermon to the prison mates that basically God is, you should believe in one God and this and that. And then you see the dream again. God is not in the dream. So it's sort of like a aside in the story, right? And then here again, God is brought up. Allah forbid, the women reply when clearing Joseph. And then here at the end, Inna Allaha yajzil mutasaddiqeen. Indeed, Allah rewards the charitable and this and that. So basically, what I'm trying to show you is the fact that God, you know, even though this is an interesting difference in the Quran, is that even though it's a story that brings up God less, and it's a little bit more subtle in the way it brings it up, yet every now and then Allah does bring himself up, and sometimes he will actually stop the narrative and speak himself, reminding everyone of himself, that he's there, that he's in control of everything. So the examples we saw are of like that. So at the end, Joseph giving this speech about God. In the middle here, God sort of talking about the story, and then he stops and then he mentions, and thus we establish Joseph in the land, and Allah is predominant over his affairs. So even though these are stories where God is less mentioned, yet every now and then Allah in the Quran takes the time to mention himself and remind us of himself and this and that. And that's an interesting story, interesting difference than in the Bible. So, you know, the Quran is a lot more interested than the Bible about reminding you of God and reminding you of the one God. It's a lot more focused on God and this and that. So even when we come to this story, which is a little bit more different in the Quran, still the author every now and then will take the time out to mention himself, to mention that he's Allah and whatnot, that God is brought up. Whereas in the Genesis story, brought up less, right? You have a lot more other details. So even in the more subtle story, every now and then God is brought up, and that sort of goes well into the sort of the goals of the Quran. Here you can see the sort of the more the secular dreams and this and that, in that God is absent in the dreams. The other interesting thing about this is the fact that the Quran uses, in this story in particular, this chapter is interesting in the Quran. It's different in the Quran in that it will use religious language in a secular way. So here you can see Joseph says about God that he's Rabbi, he's my Lord. This in reference to God. But yet, what we find is the same word is used for humans in the story, and that's rare of the Quran. The Rabb is basically about God in the Quran, yet this story is different in that it uses that religious term and it applies that in a secular way, right? So that's another evidence with the Quran is this story is different in that it's religious terms, it's religious things in a more secular way. So Rabb here, Joseph speaks about his master, the one who bought him from Egypt, and he called him Innahu Rabbi ahsana maswaya. Indeed, he's my Lord that has taken good care of me. And this could actually be a reference to God or Joseph, or the master. But it's interesting in the Quran in that it can be both. So that interpretation is open in the Quran, and I think here you can see many interpreters mean this to mean the husband, the master. And so even if it actually in reality is a reference to God, still it reminds you of his master in the story, right? So that Rabb, which is a religious term meaning my Lord, my master, which is used for God in the Quran, here now is used for the master of Joseph, because of course he was a slave in the Quran. So that's an example of religious terms in a secular way. Here you can see the same thing, where Joseph says to the prisoner when he's being released that mention me to your Lord, right? Mention me to your Lord. Where is that? Where did I put that? Okay. فَيَسْقِي رَبَّهُ خَمْرًا. So he will serve his wine. So he will serve wine to his master. So there's actually another example that I was mentioning, but here's another one that Joseph says to them, he will serve your Rabb wine. So it's interesting the Quran is doing that. Even this term, Al-Aziz. This is a term usually used in the Quran for a god. He's called Al-Aziz in the Quran. Yet here, it's being used for the minister, right? The minister who was the master of Joseph. Again, a word that's usually used for God in the Quran being used for a man. So that's secular words, or sort of religious words and religious tones in a secular way. Again, the Quran following that pattern that we find in Genesis, right? Again, remember Genesis was doing that. Now the Quran is doing the same thing. Religious tones in a more secular way, right? Here's another example. Ya ayyuhal aziz. They call Joseph Al-Aziz. Again, Al-Aziz is usually used in the Quran for God. So here's an example of Allah being called God, Rabb in the Quran. Rabbil Alameen. This is the first verse of the Quran. First sign of the Quran. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. All praise and thanks is for Allah, Rabb of all the worlds. Right? Here's an example of God being called Al-Aziz. Inna Allah laqawiyyun aziz. Indeed, Allah is all strong. Al-Aziz, the Almighty. Right? So again, this is an example of then the Quran bringing God back up, which I was mentioning before, that even though God is brought up less, every now and then Allah makes sure to mention himself so that you don't forget that everything, ultimately, this whole story, the whole point of this story is that God is the one who's in control of your affairs. So every now and then, God will go out of his way to mention himself. So he's like, this is how he inspired Joseph to plan. He could not have taken his brother under the king's law, but Allah had so willed. We elevate and rank whoever we will, but above those ranking in knowledge is the one all-knowing. And you'll notice, let's see if I have it here. No, I don't know if I have it. Okay, I'll see if I can find it. But basically, what I was talking about is, even in this, right? So here it is. In this story, Joseph says to the king of Egypt, "Inni hafizun alim." Indeed, I am reliable and knowing. And even this word alim is usually only used for God. Even in this chapter, it's used for God. Here, that Allah is alim, right? وَفَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ, and above every person of knowledge is one who is more knowledgeable. So ultimately, this goes back to God. And even here we have the mention of okay, maybe I won't find it, but the point is, okay, so here it is. إِنَّهُ السَّمِيعُ الْعَلِيمُ. This is talking about God. Indeed, he is all-hearing, al-alim, all-knowing. Right? So the point is, you find a lot of this religious language used in a secular way in the Quran, and that's similar to what Genesis was doing with the dreams and this and that, right? Even here, the person is called king. Joseph goes to the king and this and that. Fi din al-Malik, in the religion of the king, and usually even that word Malik is used for God. فَتَعَالَى اللَّهُ الْمَلِكُ الْحَقِّ. Exalted is Allah, the true king, right? Right. Let's see. Whoever denies. So, but the Quran is in stark contrast to the disappearance of God in the story. Allah brings himself back up. So remember how I was talking about how after Genesis 39, God disappears in the Joseph story until the end? The Quran takes that and reverses it. So, unlike the Genesis story where after 39, God disappears, Allah again makes it a point to keep showing up every now and then, interrupting the narrative to add some comments about himself and how he was really taking care of everything, or the characters mentioning him. And I've talked about this before as well, right? So here is interesting because this is inna dina inda Allahi al-Islam. Usually this word deen is used for religion. Indeed, the correct religion in the sight of God is Islam. The only religion in the sight of God is Islam. But again, here in Surah Yusuf, this word deen is used for fi din al-Malik, which means under the king's law. So this is another word, deen in the Quran, which usually refers to religion and it has very religious overtones. Suddenly, when we get to this surah, a characteristic is now it's used in a secular way, in the king's law, right? So again, the Quran doing the first point, doing another thing similar to the Genesis story, sort of paralleling this idea of religious tones in a secular way, right? But then I showed you the contrast, which was that every now and then Allah will bring himself back up, and he doesn't disappear in the story, even though he's mentioned less. It's more subtle, similar to Genesis, but still a difference is in the story Allah will bring himself back up, unlike in the Genesis story, right? And so there are many examples of that. Even halfway through the story, you have this sermon given about monotheism. So again, these are more examples of God being brought up. So you can read all these, like Jacob says to them, this did not help them. So basically that, God, that I cannot help you against God at all. I've lied upon him and this and that, and how they could not, when they did what their father instructed them, they could not help them against the will of God. And many examples of this in the Quran, where every few verses God will sort of disrupt the narrative and mention himself again. Right? Okay, next up, Joseph's dream fulfillment. So how many pages are we in actually? Okay, so we're doing well. we're doing well. So Joseph's dreams fulfillment seems like this is why this one of the two dreams was chosen. In the second dream, you have the sun and moon too, but not in the first dream. So in Genesis, you have two stories, or sorry, you have two dreams, and they're both basically about the same thing. That Joseph, basically his family will be prostrating to him. But it's the second dream of Joseph which specifically mentions that his mother as well is going to be prostrating to him. Right? So here in the first dreams, they were just, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed to him. He's talking to his brothers. So in the first dream, only the brothers bowing down to him are mentioned. In the second dream, both the 11 stars, who are his 11 brothers, but also the sun and the moon are mentioned bowing down to him, and the sun and the moon are the father and mother. As Jacob points out, will your mother and I, meaning your mother and I, your father, bow down to you. The Quran omits the first dream, it mentions the second dream only. Why would it do that? Well, it's likely, or it's at least very possible, that the reason it's doing it is because the Quran wants to correct a problem in the Joseph story when it comes to the tree. Right? What is that problem? That problem is the fact that in the end of the story, Jacob's dream or Joseph's dream is not fulfilled, and I talked about this in Intertextuality 2, which is why I won't go into too much detail. So if you want, you can go back to the prostration stories in Intertextuality 2 when I mentioned this. But the point is, at the end of the story, in Genesis, his brothers prostrate to him. I believe his father prostrates, but his mother doesn't prostrate. In fact, the mother dies in the story. And so this actually turned out to be a big problem for the Jews and Christians. And so some rabbis were like, oh, this means dreams can be fulfilled partially, which doesn't make sense because dreams are supposed to be revelation. So what can revelation be half wrong and half correct? Doesn't make sense. Then some other rabbi said, no, well, his mother must have resurrected. Right, so they made up this whole account of his mother resurrecting, maybe that's what happened, and that's how the dream was fulfilled and this and that. Why? Because it's a big problem in the Bible and it's a contradiction. Yet the Quran decides to fix this, and that's why it even mentions, interestingly, at the end of the story, وَرَفَعَ أَبَوَيْهِ عَلَى الْأَرْشِ, and he put both his parents on the throne. So let me see if I can find the verse. So here's the verse. That he raised his parents to the throne. That's interesting because beforehand, his mother is never mentioned in the story. She is at the end here, right? When basically he welcomed his parents into Egypt and then rose them on the throne. But before, his mother's not mentioned. Only Jacob's mentioned. So why suddenly have his mother appear at the end? Well, it seems what's happening here is the Quran is correcting the biblical account where the mother dies. The Quran is saying no, rather she was alive and she did fulfill the dream, and the dream did get fulfilled. Because there's a very important theological thing that dreams, which are prophecy in both Judeo-Christian and Muslim tradition, they're coming from God, right? So God's not going to make a mistake. So it seems like this is why the second dream has been chosen and the first dream omitted, because this is the dream the Quran had to correct, right? Because this was a big theological problem. And so it goes out of his way to mention even his mother prostrated, and that's not in the Bible, right? Why mention the fact that his mother is also prostrating, his parents as a whole, when before only Jacob was being mentioned in the story? So we're seeing quite a lot of interaction actually. Joseph and Jacob in the beginning of the story. So in the beginning, Jacob is sort of I think this is supposed to say what was more important. So I think this is supposed to say Joseph is sort of portrayed a little bit negatively, also as a deceiver and this and that. And also there's an important thing in that in the biblical story, the success of Joseph in the world is more highlighted, whereas in the Quran, the idea that no, the hereafter reward is a lot more important is the one which is more highlighted, right? So we see here. So basically, the Quran corrects this idea that Joseph was, somehow had it coming to him. The Quran, he's totally innocent, whereas in the Bible he is not, right? And again, in the Quran, the every now and then you find this mention of وَلَأَجْرُ الْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ لِلَّذِينَ right? وَلَأَجْرُ الْآخِرَةِ خَيْرٌ لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَكَانُوا يَتَّقُونَ. And the reward of the hereafter is far better for those who are faithful and are mindful of Allah. So it's stressed in the Quran the fact that yes, Joseph ended up getting all these worldly things, but the hereafter is where the real reward is. Whereas in the Bible, it's more just the worldly accomplishments of Joseph are mentioned, and there's not really much of a mention of the hereafter in this and as to the Quran interacting with the story by making sure it points out the fact that no, it's the hereafter which really matters. Right. So here we have an interesting thing. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of the Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Right. So the success here, it's mentioned his success in everything he did. There's the worldly success, right? So Joseph's being mentioned in terms of his worldly success. So he put him in charge of the household, entrusted everything to him. From the time he put him in charge of his household, of all things he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the fields. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care with Joseph installed, but he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. And Joseph was handsome, and his master's wife took notice and said, "Come to bed with me." So you notice here the point was success. Joseph is success. What is the context? Meaning his success in the worldly life, right? He was a good worldly guy. Success in everything he was doing. In the Quran, success is also mentioned, interestingly, in the same, near the same story. So here you see this is just before the mention of the wife trying to seduce him story. In the Quran, in the actual wife trying to seduce him story, Joseph says, إِنَّهُ لَا يُفْلِحُ الظَّالِمُونَ. Indeed, wrongdoers do not succeed. They never succeed. So it's interesting, if you look at the context there, it's mentioned the fact that he says no to the master's wife, and then he's saying basically that wrongdoers, the meaning here is they don't succeed with God. Right? They don't succeed in terms of their righteousness and this and that. They don't succeed in terms of favor with God. So interesting in that the Joseph story mentions in the very, very similar place the fact that he was successful in the worldly life, but the Quran, when it mentions success, has it to be in the spiritual side of things and the hereafter and this and that. إِنَّهُ لَا يُفْلِحُ الظَّالِمُونَ, Joseph says. Indeed, wrongdoers never succeed. Okay? So, where are we? Okay, we're on 24. وَلَمَّا بَلَغَ أَشُدَّهُ آتَيْنَاهُ حُكْمًا وَعِلْمًا وَكَذَلِكَ نَجْزِي الْمُحْسِنِينَ. And when he reached maturity, we gave him wisdom and knowledge, and thus do we reward the good doers. So again, look how here, so this is the same event being described, how when after he was under the master, how God favored him. Here in the Quran, these favors are spiritual, right? But here in the Bible, they're more like just success in everything he does, more worldly, right? So Quran has more of an emphasis on the spiritual thing. So the other interesting thing is that the dialogue in both the Genesis story and in the Quran are very similar in terms of their layout, their format. So basically the dialogue between Joseph and the wife echoes. There's a small phrase followed by a short speech. In the Quran, وراودته التي هو في بيتها عن نفسه وغلقت الأبواب وقالت هيت لك قال معاذ الله إنه ربي أحسن مثواي إنه لا يفلح الظالمون. And the lady in whose house he lived tried to seduce him. She locked the doors and said, "Come to me." He replied, "Allah is my refuge. It is not right to betray my master who has taken good care of me. Indeed, the wrongdoers never succeed." So you look how he gives a short speech. After she says a small thing, "Come to me," then he gives a short speech. It's similar in the Bible, where the wife says, come to bed with me. And then he gives a sort of a short speech. But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" So, small phrase, "come to bed with me." Here's small phrase, "come to me," then a short sort of a speech. And you'll notice again, in this speech in the Bible, it's all worldly things. It's worldly things mostly, right? No one is greater in this house except I. Everything he owns he has entrusted to me, right? My master has not withheld anything from me. Whereas in the Quran, the emphasis is on the spiritual. Ma'az Allah. Allah is my refuge. It is not right for me to betray my Lord, right? While he has taken good care of me. Indeed, wrongdoers don't succeed. So there's a mention of his master here, but it's packaged within the mention of God and the spiritual and this and that. And even this, innahu rabbi ahsana maswaya. Indeed, my Lord, he is my Lord, who has made my residence good. This is actually, in my opinion, both a reference to God and a reference to his master. So when he's saying it, he's meaning to say God, but the reason he uses the term Rabbi is because that's the same term that would be used for his master, right? The same word is used in the story for God and his master and the masters of the slaves and this and that. So the woman, when she's hearing it, she thinks of her husband, she thinks of his master. But when Joseph's saying it, he's referring to God. So it has a double meaning. You could also see it like that. That even if the reference is to God, the woman would still be thinking it's about the husband. So there's sort of a double meaning here in the Quran. So even that would be spiritual. However, there's an interesting difference in that in the Quran, Joseph remembers Allah first, then his master, whereas in the Bible, God comes second, and the primary thing is his master. So here, remember, in the Quran, the first thing he says is, Ma'az Allah. Allah is my refuge. Then he mentions his master. Again, many said this is master, but you can see this as mentioning both God and his master, right? It has a double meaning. Innahu Rabbi ahsana maswaya. Indeed, he is my Lord, who has taken good care of me. First God, then his master. Innahu la yuflihu zalimun. Indeed, wrongdoers never succeed. But here in the Bible, a long speech of his master, my master, my master, my master, he has entrusted everything, no one is greater, my master, and then at the end God. So in the Quran, God comes first, then the master, but in the Bible, first the master, then the Quran. So the Quran sort of teaching us what are the priorities. And you'll notice it's very similar to the Genesis story, right? So you're seeing a lot of linguistic interactions here. Like think about, we've seen a bunch of these things now. So is it just a coincidence that we're finding these parallels in the Quran and the Bible, and not only that, we're finding these interesting subtle differences, right? So this is the interesting thing that we're doing in this episode. We're looking at sort of when we compare two accounts, and we already know the Quran has deep knowledge of these books. So now we can do this. Now we can actually look at these from the lens of, okay, so how's the Quran interacting with these stories? We see even very deep within the linguistics and the text that there's this interesting interactions, right? So again, short phrase, short speech, short phrase, short speech, but then God is the one first mentioned, whereas here the master is first mentioned. So very interesting. The other parallel you find in the stories is that there's a mention of shirt over and over again. So the shirt is a theme in the Quran. It's also a theme in the Bible. So here in the Bible, basically, she caught him by his cloak and said, come to bed with me, but he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. There's another incident when she tried to seduce him again in the Bible. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me, right? She kept his cloak beside her until his master, right? In the Quran, you also have this story associated with a cloak, but it's a different, associated with a shirt, but it's a little bit differently told. So again, shirts are brought up in this story again, but in a sort of different way. They raced for the door, and she tore his shirt from the back, only to find her husband at the door. She cried, "What is the penalty for someone who tried to violate your wife except imprisonment or painful punishment?" Joseph responded, "It was he who tried to seduce me, and a witness from her own family testified, if his shirt is torn from the front, then she has told the truth and he is a liar, but if his shirt is torn from the back, then she has lied and he is truthful." So when her husband saw that Joseph's shirt was torn from the back, he said, "This must be an example of the cunning of you women. Indeed, your cunning is so shrewd." Also notice here how in the Quranic story the shirt is used to exonerate him, free him from the charge, but in the Bible Joseph is blamed and put into prison because the shirt is used as evidence against him. So that Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me, but as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. So he's showing the husband and this and that, and the husband takes this as evidence and imprisons Joseph, whereas in the Quran it's the opposite. The shirt is evidence for the innocence of Joseph. Whereas in the Bible, yes, Joseph's innocent, but sort of what I mean to say, it's used as evidence. It's to the Potiphar to make him think that Joseph did try and seduce. Okay. The next interesting thing in the story is that there's the mention of the cutting of the hands, and this is in the Jewish text. This is actually in the Talmud. But it seems, from what I've been told, that this came just after the Quran. So from what I've heard, the text is dated after the Quran, of this being in the Talmud. But it might be that this is still a tradition which goes back to pre-Quran. Why? Because they mention that our sages tell us. So our sages inform us, which means it's a tradition that seems to be going back. So even though this section in the Talmud is dated to after the Quran, a little bit after, just a little bit after, still it seems it's coming from way back in Jewish traditions, because they're talking about the fact that it's been passed down from their sages. And so you see, it's mentioned in the Talmud, this Jewish tradition, that on one occasion Potiphar's wife assembled a number of Egyptian women so that they might see how very handsome Joseph was. But before she summoned Joseph, she gave each of them an etrog and a knife. When they saw Joseph's handsome countenance, they cut their hands. She said to them, "If this can happen to you, who can see him only once, how much more so does it happen to me, who must look at him constantly? Each day he strove to entice him with his words. She strove to entice blah blah blah. But he suppressed his evil inclination," and blah blah blah. Okay? In the Quran, the same story is mentioned, right? When she heard about their gossip, or heard some women of the city gossip, the chief minister's wife is trying to seduce a slave boy. Love for him has plagued her heart. Indeed, we see that she is clearly mistaken. When she heard about this gossip, she invited them and set a banquet for them. She gave each one a knife, then said to Joseph, "Come out before them." When they saw him, they were stunned by his beauty that they cut their hands and exclaimed, "Good God, this cannot be human. This must be a noble angel." So remember, there was no Arabic form of this story, right? Remember in the beginning I talked about how the fact that the Jews were challenging the Prophet Muhammad through the Arabs. They were saying, "Okay, Arabs, ask him for the story about Joseph and his brothers," right? And so when we come to the Quran, not only is it recounting narratives that are found in the Genesis text and interacting with them, it's also has this thing which is not in Genesis. This story is not actually, this part of the story is not actually in Genesis. It's found in Rabbinic tradition. Remember, the Talmud was not translated till 2012. Remember, the Bible was not translated until 150 years after. Bible was not translated until 150 years after the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The Talmud was just recently translated in Arabic in 2012. Yet the Quran has this thing from Jewish tradition. So in response to the Jews, not only do you find the story which is in Genesis, but also interaction with the Genesis account, but you also find this thing which is in Rabbinic tradition, which shows, again, a deep knowledge of the stories. So in Jewish tradition, as Saqib Hussein points out, this event occurs after the assault, before the husband, which doesn't make sense with the Genesis account. But the Quran is unique in that it pushes it forward. Okay, Catherine Marie Sider Hamilton says, one exegetical move is adopted and another added to it, and an interpretive tradition is born. In the process, Scripture leaves the limits of the text. The story of Joseph grows beyond the bounds of its biblical telling to incorporate in the traditions passed down by various communities of faith, various non-biblical traditions, citrons and knives, for example, and a court full of women who are so struck by Joseph's beauty that they cut their hands. All of these events serving to explicate Genesis' oddly placed phrase after these things. Okay? Okay, so basically, I think we have to go back to Genesis 39 to figure out what's going on here. So go to sort of Genesis 39 to sort of get the explanation of this. So after the prison. Okay. So you can find in the Rabbinic tradition they were mentioning Genesis 39:7. Okay, so, and after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me," and this and that. Okay, so here it's mentioning how, in rabbinic tradition, this idea of the cutting of the hands and this and that, this happens before, uh, she tries to seduce him and this and that. That doesn't really make sense because, it says here she only noticed him and tried to seduce him after a while, right? So the placement, so they got the tradition, they had the tradition passed down to them, but the way they sort of tried to incorporate it into the Genesis story doesn't make sense, right? This event, assault before the husband. So this event occurs before the assault, so before the woman, basically before the wife tries to seduce him, right? And that doesn't make sense with the Genesis account because, again, it's mentioned now she tried to seduce him, but then there's this whole mention of them trying to seduce her beforehand, right? And she says to them, "If this can happen to you who see him only once, how much more so does it happen to me who must look at him constantly," right? Each day she strove to entice him with his words, but he suppressed his evil inclination and all this. This doesn't make sense with Genesis because in Genesis it's talking about the fact that after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph. So if this tradition, the Jewish tradition, is placed beforehand, well, she's already noticed him and tried to seduce him. So Genesis doesn't make sense when it's saying after a while she took notice of him and called him to bed and this and that. That doesn't make sense. So what the Quran does, interestingly, is it corrects it. It places this account after the attempts at seducing him. In the Quran, what happens is she tries to seduce him, Joseph is shown as innocent, then she does this whole story where the women basically hear that she tried to seduce him, so then she brings them and the whole cutting hand scenario happens. Then she says, if he doesn't sleep with me, I'm going to jail him, and then they sort of frame Joseph, and he's put in prison after that, after being framed. So now this event of the hand cutting actually makes sense because the Quran takes the event and it places it in its correct chronological order so that it actually reads and makes sense with the story. Whereas when the rabbis tried to take this tradition and fit it into the Bible, they put it in the wrong place. So it doesn't make any sense. So that's another example of a literary interaction that's going on, which is the tradition is taken and then it's put into its right place. So again, if Muhammad was just learning these things, and of course we showed it couldn't have happened, then he would have made the same mistakes the rabbis made. But he didn't. He fixed it. Or of course, Allah fixed it. There's no way Muhammad, peace be upon him, could have known these things because of the things I mentioned before. But that shows you deep insight into the rabbinic text and the Jewish text, and then interacting with them and correcting them by placing this event in the right order so that it actually makes sense, right? Otherwise, the rabbinic text makes no sense, right? How could she be talking about how she tries to seduce him every day and how, it's so hard, I have to look at him all the time? But this is the explanation of Genesis 37, where they're saying after all these things, his master's wife cast eye on him, and here she explained that all this to explicate Genesis' oddly placed phrase after these things. After these things, she took notice, right? So after a while and whatnot. So the Genesis story is kind of weirdly placed, unlike the biblical, unlike the Quranic narrative. So again, let's go to the next thing. So she asserts authority over him, use of slave all of a sudden, and you wouldn't pick up on it if you didn't know the story by reading it before he was honored. Okay, use of slave all of a sudden. So before in the story, basically Joseph is honored. He's honored in Genesis, but now suddenly she calls him a slave and tries to dishonor him. Right. So here it talks about he was well built and handsome, and he found favor and this and that. But then suddenly, when he refuses to go to bed, now suddenly out of nowhere he's called a slave. That Hebrew slave you brought us. This is how your slave treated me, this and that. Right? That's what's happening in Genesis. Interestingly, the Quran mentions the same thing as well, the word slave, but it's used to actually honor him. وَلَقَدْ هَمَّتْ بِهِ وَهَمَّ بِهَا لَوْلَا أَرْوَأَ بُرْهَانَ رَبِّهِ كذلك لنصرف عنه السوء والفحشاء إنه من عبادنا المخلصين. She advanced towards him, and he would have done likewise had he not seen a sign from his Lord. This is how we kept evil and indecency away from him, for surely he was truly one of our chosen slaves. The word in Arabic is ibadina, which means our slaves, our chosen slaves. So, whereas in this story, the word slave is suddenly brought up, and it's the woman who's speaking it, and she's speaking it to dishonor Joseph. In the Quran, Allah brings up the word, and he uses it to honor him by talking about how he's from our chosen slaves, right? And also, she asserts her authority over him here in the Bible. And here, when we go here, she also tries to assert authority over him, right? So that Hebrew slave you brought us in this and that. This your slave mistreated me. So she's trying to talk about the fact that she's higher than him. He's just a slave. I have authority over him by calling him a slave and this and that. And interestingly, in the Quran, it's similar. In this story, they mention... okay, I think maybe it's below. Right, so here she tries to assert authority over him. She says to the husband, "What is the penalty for someone who tried to violate your wife except imprisonment of painful punishment?" And here she was complaining to the husband as well, and talking about how this your slave has mistreated me, and the master heard the story, he was burned with anger and this and that, right? So trying to impose her authority over him. So this is the only time the word slave is used in the surah, which is interesting because there was another opportunity. The word slave could actually have been used here. He himself, so the brother said basically this is the recompense for the thief. If you're stolen, this should be the punishment. Its recompense is that he whose bag in it is found, himself will be the recompense. Thus do we recompense the wrongdoers. What is mentioned here is he will become the slave. So slave could have been mentioned here, but it wasn't. It was only reserved for this part in the story, which ties into Genesis, where the word slave is being used. So it's interesting, the Quran could have used slave elsewhere, but it only used it in this part in the story. And is it just a coincidence that slave is also used in the Bible, in this passage? Not only that, but it's used to dishonor Joseph, whereas in the Quran it's used to honor him. Here you can see the translation, our chosen slaves. Okay. Interestingly, this ayah also goes back to a Jewish tradition, or Syriac traditions. So, basically they say what will happen, basically what should be the recompense of, basically the guy's asking, okay, well, if it turns out you are the thieves, what will be the punishment? What will be the recompense? And the brothers say its recompense is that he in whose bag it is found, he himself will be its recompense. Thus do we recompense the wrongdoers. This is found in Syriac tradition. It's not actually found in the Bible. He said to them, and if I do find it, what will happen? They all said, we will all be slaves to your Lord. So here you found the thing, the penalty. Okay, right. We will all be slaves to your Lord. So here actually you can see the word slaves is used. In the Quran it was reserved for the Genesis reference, right? But you see this sort of part of the story, which is not in Genesis, is in Rabbinic tradition, which again shows extra detailed knowledge of not only the Bible and interacting with the Bible directly, but also these other traditions. Here's another example of her trying to assert her dominance over her. Right, and if he does not do what I order him, he will certainly be imprisoned and disgraced. Okay. Here you can mention, here they mention Potiphar is the captain of Pharaoh's guard, who is said to have purchased Joseph as a slave, and impressed by his intelligence, makes him the master of his household. Unfortunately, Potiphar's wife, who is known for her infidelities, took a liking to Joseph and attempted to seduce him. When Joseph refused her advances and ran off, she retaliated by falsely accusing him of trying to rape her, and Potiphar had Joseph imprisoned. According to G.J. Wenham, execution was normal in rape cases, and so the story implies that Potiphar had doubts about his wife's account. That's interesting, because in the Quran, he knows that she's innocent. Yusuf, so the husband, it's proven to him that he was innocent, so he knows that he was innocent. Joseph, ignore this, and my wife, asked forgiveness for your sins. Indeed, you were of the sinful. Right? Interesting that this was a sort of subtly hinted to in Genesis as well. Although then later on in the Quran, it seems that they do frame him properly. The women do frame him, and that's why he ends up going to prison. But even then, it's mentioned من بعد ما رأوا الآيات, after they had seen signs of his innocence. So even then, the Quran mentioned the fact that they had seen signs which showed them that he was innocent. They still imprisoned him. So that ties into this as well, because Potiphar sort of had doubts. So he had seen signs that he was actually innocent, yet he imprisoned him. Right. Interesting how in both Genesis and Quran she starts off soft, then becomes aggressive, right? So, so in the beginning she's like, lie with me, right? And then she's like, lie with me and this and that. And then after he refuses, she becomes very harsh. That Hebrew slave he brought, and this and that. This Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep. So very harsh. Starts off very nice, soft, then harsh. In the Quran, it's similar. She begins very soft. So this is verse 23. It should actually be above. But it's like, come you. She invites him. She's like, come you. Right? She's trying to seduce him. But when he refuses, he becomes harsh. What is the recompense of one who intended evil for your wife, but that he be imprisoned or painful punishment? Here, this is the one about whom you blamed me, and I certainly sought to seduce him, but he firmly refused. And if he does not do what I order him, he will surely be imprisoned and will be of those debased. So another parallel with the Genesis account. Another coincidence? Also, the mention of Haita. So she says, to try and seduce him, she says, Haita, come you. Haita. So Ibn Abbas mentioned that Haita is come you, come on, O you, in the Aramaic language. So this is what even the companions, Ibn Abbas, Mujahid, and several other scholars mentioned, that it actually is in the something which is said in the Aramaic language. It can also mean I'm ready for you. And interestingly, this phrase Haytalak is mentioned in the Bible, just in Genesis 31. Wa'ita, let me say, ata laka, wa ata laka. Right. So this is the Hebrew. Therefore, now come. Right. It's interesting that Haytalak is in the Quran. It's also in the Bible. Wa'ata laka, ata laka, hayta lak, hayta lak, wa ata laka. So it is the Hebrew equivalent, right? And it's interesting. The Quran uses this phrase hayta lak, and many scholars knew this was an Aramaic or a Hebrew phrase or something like that. And in Genesis, this is the Hebrew phrase used with the same meaning just elsewhere. So that shows you the Quranic author has now language of the has knowledge of the language itself. So this is another linguistic connection. I was talking about how I did an episode where I did many examples of how the Quran knows the language of the and interacting with the Hebrew and the linguistics and this and that. Well, here's another example of the Quran interacting with the linguistics, right? Because scholars are saying this wasn't the Arabic word. This was these were Aramaic. This was an Aramaic phrase, and we find this similar in the Hebrew of the Bible. So that's another linguistic connection. So now we have another evidence that and especially when you put it together with the other evidences that I've brought forth, it shows the author has this sort of knowledge of the language itself, right? And remember, the whole point was the Jews were challenging. Well, ask him if he knows the story of Joseph and his brothers. And so when the story is told, you find such deep connections even with the language. Okay, so where are we? Let me just check. Okay, so we should probably go quicker. Interesting parallel that us and you is used in Genesis, so the wife is trying to include the husband. The same in the Quran, she's trying to make it an us thing. Okay, so us and you in Genesis, this is how your slave treated me, right? So basically, as soon as I screamed, the Hebrew slave you brought us. So she said, so she's trying to make the connection to her husband that it's a us thing. The Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me, right? And this and that. This is how your slave, right? So she's trying to make it about us thing. It's like incorporate both of them, like they've both been wronged. Quran does, she does the same thing, right? What is the recompense of one who intended for your wife evil for your wife, but that he be imprisoned or punished, right? So she's saying I've been violated, but she's also relating it back to the husband. This is how your slave treated me, right? Your wife, right? She's making it both a husband and a wife thing in the Quran as well by mentioning that I'm your wife, right? So it's an us thing. It's not only a matter that I was wrong, but you were wronged as well. In Genesis, she does the same thing. She mentions me, she mentions us, she mentions you, right? Also, the structures are similar, or like they have some similarities in it. Of course, the Quranic structure is very intricate when it comes to the story of Joseph, but there is something similar in one of the chapters of the story in the Bible. So in Genesis 39, there's something known as an inclusio. It's basically, in biblical studies, inclusio is a literary device based on a concentric principle, also known as bracketing, or an envelope structure, which consists of creating a frame by placing similar material at the beginning and end of a section, although whether this material should consist of a word or phrase or blah, 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 blah. So here's the inclusio in chapter 39. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of the Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him here. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. At the end, but while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. And this and that, right? So, and then here in the beginning, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of everything and this and that. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had and whatnot. And here, so the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in everything he did. Right? The blessing of the Lord, the blessing, and then the Lord was with him. So this is called a inclusio. So basically, the beginning of this chapter is sort of a parallel in the end of the chapter, and then in the middle there's a lot of stuff. That's sort of similar, or okay, so let's see, there's also inclusio. So basically what they're saying is there was an inclusio with the Lord being Joseph as well, being with Joseph, as well as Joseph being responsible for things. Only difference is this time he's also responsible for food, so his power is actually increasing. So that's interesting. Here the only thing he was not responsible for was the food. That was the thing that Potiphar cared about, except the food he ate, right? But here he's also made in charge of the food. He's made in charge of everything, right? So his power is increasing. I don't know what this is doing here. Okay, so this is a mirror motif, turns out. So this is a mirror motif in the Bible. So basically Genesis 40, there's the mention, oh right, so Genesis 40, there is the mention of, sometime later, the man who carried the king's cup and the man who made the king's bread did wrong against the king of Egypt. Joseph, or Pharaoh, was angry with these two important men. The head kept carrying the head bread maker, so he put them in prison under the care of the head of the soldiers, the same place where Joseph was in prison. The head of the soldiers had Joseph watch over them. He took care of them, and they were in prison for a long time. So this word here for Joseph was in prison is actually pit. And Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. At the end, he comes out of the pit, similar to him coming out of the well as a pit, right? Because the well was a pit, and the clothes from before, right? And here you also find the clothes are mentioned. So, and when he shaved himself and changed his clothes, so again the clothes come up. Remember, there was the shirt beforehand. Now the clothes come up again, but now they're clean clothes, right? So the mention of him coming out of the pit is very similar to the fact that he shed no blood from in this pit. This is what the brothers were saying when they were saying put him in the well. So this is called a mirror motif. And at the beginning of the story, they stripped him of his robe and they put him in the pit. Here in Genesis 40, they took him out of the pit and he changed his clothes. So this is called a mirror motif in the Bible. So it's sort of like a parallel, sort of interesting structure, right? So the opposite things happening. So they gets in a pit, and so he's put in a pit, and he's stripped off his clothes. Then he then he's put out again, comes out of the pit, and he changes his clothes. Before that, we had an inclusio, right? Interestingly, when we come to the Quran structure, we find similar things, but just a lot more detail, right? So actually, the other thing I wanted to mention again here also the shirt is mentioned in the Quran. Take this shirt, take this, but this is at the end of the Quran. So end of the chapter. Take this, my shirt, and cast it over the face of my father. He will become seeing and bring me your family all together. So in the beginning of the story, there's this mention of his shirt, which had the blood of Joseph on it, and it's sort of supposed to represent the hardship that Jacob is going through. And Jacob knows it's false blood, but it's still supposed to represent the sort of difficulty of the situation he's in. But then at the end of the story, there's another shirt, and this is the shirt of relief, sort of the shirt of good news, the shirt that's supposed to represent everything's going to be all right, because the shirt that will cure his blindness and is the sign that he's going to reunite with Joseph. So there's this sort of mirror motif in the Quran as well, right? So just like in the Bible, he's put in a pit, and we know that the Bible on purpose is calling the prison a pit. Why would he call a prison a pit? Because it's trying to connect it back to the well being a pit, and then talking about how in the well that he was stripped, now he gets new clothes. So now the order gets reversed, just like he was humiliated before by being put in the pit and being stripped. Now he is exonerated by being taken out of the pit, and his clothes change, so that shows his fortune has changed, quote unquote. In the Quran, it's the same thing. First, the shirt of hardship, now the shirt of relief. Also, you'll notice that here that the parallel. What I would say is that it's a hardship that happens, and at the exact same time, but it's a reverse, and that's what we find in the Quran as well, as I'll show you right now. But anyway, the point is this sort of mirror motif and this inclusio. We have similar things in the Quran. It's just a lot more sophisticated, a lot more structured. So, for example, you have actually ring structure in this chapter. So that means the first part, the first stuff that's mentioned in this chapter corresponds to the last, second to the second last, third to the third last. Then you have the middle stuff. This middle stuff, you actually have an internal ring. So you have another ring structure in the middle. Then you have another ring structure. Actually, if you look at the events that happened to him. The other thing you'll notice is a hardship happens to him, then another hardship, then another hardship. Then all those hardships get sort of undone and reversed. So it's the same thing like how in the Bible, you first have this a difficult thing that happens to him, that he's put in the pit and his clothes are stripped away. And then the same event is supposed to be a representation of the fact that now it's all fixed, that now he's taken out of the pit and good clothes come to him. Similar in the Quran, a bad thing happens to him, then it gets reversed. Right, that same thing, but reversed. For example, he's enslaved, then he's made treasure. He resists temptation. It's admitted that he didn't. That she admits that, or that she says, "I didn't cheat him." The assault by her, she admits her wrong. The put on display, cut hands. The women declare her innocent. Imprisoned, freed. Dreams of the inmates interpreted. Dreams of the king interpreted. Freed inmate forget. Freed inmate remembers, and whatnot. Okay, so here you can see the whole story has a ring structure. Even the beginning and end have ring structure of the chapter, and I've discussed this in my organization video. And here even you have a parallel theme. So remember how you had this sort of mirror motif in the Bible, that you have this parallel, and then the end is parallel as well. It's the same stuff, just parallel when describing another event. You have this sort of parallel thing in the story in the Quran as well. When it comes to, and by the way, this is another internal ring, but in the Quran you have this the separation stuff with Jacob and the brothers, and the reunion stuff. The events, whilst also being part of the ring, also form a nice parallel structure with each other. The first brother schemes for Joseph, then Joseph schemes for the brothers, then brother pleads to take Joseph, brothers plead to take Benjamin, abandon Joseph, brothers lose Benjamin, brothers return to Jacob with fake blood, return to Jacob speaking truthfully, brothers bring Joseph's shirt with false blood, and then here brothers bring Joseph's genuine shirt. Jacob resorts to patient. Jacob resigns to patience. Why are these shirts? Why is this reversed? I explained this in the organization part. Also, just explained it with the fact that it's the shirts now representing opposite things, right? And there's an explanation. The shirts flipped are interesting because in the face of bad news, having patience versus getting resolutions. In the bad news, having patience versus getting resolution. So in the first hand, the shirt is supposed to be a sign that you have to have patience. In the second, the shirt is a sign that of resolution and reunion because of your patience, a reward for your patience. So it's an interesting lesson. First, the shirt causes misery, then the shirt causes joy. It's two different shirts, right? Conclusion, the Quran, the Revelation. Okay, so the conclusion also has stuff which is mentioned in the introduction, the Quran, the Revelation, the Quran, the nation of messengers, the mention of signs, similar stopping comments, then back to messenger and story and whatnot. Okay. Also, another aspect of the Quran is the fact that it will take these long passages in the Bible, the biblical story, and then summarize them in sort of distinct phases. So, for example, this is actually a whole chapter in the Bible. The Quran just summarizes it in one ayah, one side, one quote-unquote verse. This whole event. And this is quite characteristic of the Quran. It does it elsewhere as well. For example, in chapter 2, 251, it summarizes a bunch of chapters in the Bible with just a few phrases. They defeated them by the permission of Allah, and David killed Goliath, and Allah gave him kingship and wisdom and taught him from what he had willed, and this and that. These are actually long chapters in the Bible. The Quran simply summarizing them with a few phrases. So that's an interesting interaction as well. Next, we have the Quran correcting the Bible from a historical point of view. So the Bible makes a mistake in that both in the time of Abraham and in the time of Joseph, it calls the leader of Egypt Pharaoh. And we know that at that time he was not called Pharaoh, he was called king. And so the Quran in the story of Joseph calls him a king. If you want to see the evidence, you can read all this here. You can probably go in the doc and the description, read it too. Or you can go to Intertextuality 2, where I explain this subject in detail. Point is, the Quran is correcting it from a historical standpoint. Right. Here you can see Pharaoh originally used in the New Kingdom, and the Joseph stories in the Old Kingdom, as scholars will agree. Next up, we have the fact that Genesis is playing out in its narrative the sort of promises to Abraham. So Abraham has made a bunch of promises, and then basically the rest of the Genesis story is sort of playing out these promises. And so the story of Joseph is important because it's the beginning of one of those promises being fulfilled, and that's the idea that Israel is going to be a blessing to the rest of the nations, and that all the nations are going to be blessed through them. So this is begun in the Genesis story of Joseph, because that's when the Israelites enter Egypt. But that's them entering into a different nation to bless them, right? So that promise of Abraham is sort of being finding fulfillment in Genesis. Genesis has many promises to Abraham, then the narrative sort of trying to show the fulfillment of these promises. And now the competition of that promise, okay. And so the Quran picks up on this idea of fulfilling promises as well. Even Joseph was the first one to have a high status position. And Genesis 17:6 mentions how some of them will be kings. So Joseph ends up having a high status position in the society, in the Egyptian society, and that also fulfills a promise in Genesis 17:6 that some of the Israelites will become kings. Also, the Canaan land being given to them is picked up on in Exodus, after which is right after. So that's the next promise after that finds fulfillment in Exodus. But the point here is that the Quran is the Bible is sort of tying this story, Joseph's story, to the Abraham and the forefathers and the promises made to them. And the Quran sort of subtly hints to this idea as well. So in Genesis 22:18, it's mentioned, and through your descendants all the nations of the earth will be blessed, all because you have obeyed me. So this is the promise. And we see that it begins in Genesis because Joseph, the Lord blessed the house of the Egyptian because of Joseph and this and that, right? So this is in Genesis, this idea that the Egyptians were starting to bless the nations. Also, I made a joke. The Egyptians, also the Israelites blessing the Egyptians. Sorry. Okay. Anyway, Quran picks up on this. Subtly hints to it. وكذلك يجتبيك ربك ويعلمك من تأويل الأحاديث ويتم نعمته عليك وعلى آل يعقوب كما أتمها على أبويك من قبل إبراهيم وإسحاق إن ربك عليم حكيم. So this is Jacob speaking to Joseph, and he says, and so will your Lord choose you and teach you the interpretation of dreams and perfect his favor upon you and the descendants of Jacob, just as he once perfected it upon your forefathers Abraham and Isaac. Surely your Lord is all-knowing, all-wise. So the idea of the perfection of favors, and one of the favors of Abraham was this promise that was made to him, right? Quran sort of hinting it has knowledge of this tradition. also interesting that Genesis, the story in Genesis is more tribal. It's about the nation of Israel and the tribal aspects of that. Whereas the story in the Quran is more about Tawheed, which means like the oneness of God, and Sabr, like patience and this and that. But this forefather aspect is brought up, and it's also hinted to here in the Quran. It's sort of a hint. Joseph is given sort of this calling the cellmates to monotheism, and he mentions a very interesting thing. He says, "I have left the religion of a people who do not believe in Allah, and they in the hereafter are disbelievers, and I follow the religion of my fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Why say this as part of your invitation to them of one God? It seems to sort of echo the tribal aspects of Genesis before. By tribal, I mean not in a negative sense, just like forming the identity of the Israelites and this and that. And so he's like, I'm not going to be like these Egyptian people. Rather, I'm going to be like my forefathers. So Quran sort of hinting to that idea as well. Why is this all brought up in this big speech where he's telling them the favor of God upon us is that we don't associate and people aren't grateful and are multiple gods better, one God better, and you don't worship except names and this and that. Seems to make sense with the biblical subtext. Also interesting how much of a deal. Okay. So basically, my point was two of the main points of the story in Genesis were the fact that it's like this tribal thing where it's instilling this sort of fear, instilling this sort of national unity within the Israelites in the Genesis story of Joseph. These tribal elements, but also the fulfillment of God's favor upon Abraham to have them be blessed, to have them bless the nations, right? Which is the fulfillment of the promise in the Quran. Even though that's not the main point, there are other points, main points of the story in the Quran. It does seem to sort of hint that it has knowledge of these, of what the point of the Genesis story is, with a few hints here and there in these ayat. Right? It's interesting also how much of a deal Joseph being wronged is in Genesis versus the Quran. Also, this idea of a special honor is being put on Pharaoh in the Bible, slash the ban, while God is secondary, but in the Quran it's flipped. Hasad, used for kindness, is usually used for God in the Bible, but here it's used for the Pharaoh. So here you see, if you read the text, then Joseph said to him, this is the meaning of it. So he interprets the dream and this and that, and then he says, before three days are okay, blah blah blah. He says, Pharaoh will give you honor and return you to your place of work, right? But remember me when it is well with you, and show me kindness. Say a good word about me to Pharaoh. Get me out of this prison. For I was stolen from the land of the Hebrews, and here I have done nothing for which they should put me in prison. So there's this long thing, and a big deal is made out of the fact that Joseph's done nothing wrong, and he's innocent, and this and that. And he's honoring the man very specially, and honoring the Pharaoh, talking about how the Pharaoh will give him honor in return. And he asks the man to show him kindness. The word there is hasad. And hasad, according to Saqib Hussein, so scholar of this stuff, is usually used for God in the Bible. And so that also ties into what I was talking about before, where the Quran uses language usually reserved for God, like Rabb, Al-Aziz, Al-Alim, and this and that, and applies them to men in the story. Even the idea of prostration is being done to men. So the Quran I talked about in the beginning, how it uses sort of religious language in a secular way. Here we find in the Bible the same thing being done. Hasad, which is usually for God in the Bible, is being used for a man, and he's putting extra emphasis on the man and this and that, and there's the extra emphasis on the fact that he is going to be that he's been wronged and this and that. But in the Quran, it's the opposite. He just mentions a small thing to him. He says, just askurni minhum askurni inda rabbik. Mention me before your master. That's it. There's not this big detailed sermon where he's complaining, and it's just mention me before your master. And then there's the mention of, but Satan made him forget to mention to his master, and he remained in prison for several years. Okay. So there's no idea of Joseph thinking he's done nothing to deserve it. Rather, throughout the Quranic story, Joseph never brings up the wrongs that have been done to him. At least, he's always about like remembering the favor of Allah upon him, and he omits the difficulties to him. And even when it comes to the difficulties he mentions them, he talks about how God has been good to him. For example, here he mentions that is the favor of Allah upon us and upon the people, but most of the people are ungrateful. Right here he says even enters prison by praying to God. But basically, when they were trying to seduce him, then Joseph said, "My Lord, prison is more to my liking than that to which they invite me, and if you do not avert me from their plan, I will incline toward them, and thus be of the ignorant." Here at the end, he's talking about this in the interpretation, "My old dream, my Lord has made it come true. He was truly kind to me when he freed me from prison and brought you all from the desert of Satan, from the desert after Satan had ignited rivalry between me and my siblings." So just blames it on Satan, and that's it. "Indeed, my Lord is subtle in fulfilling what he wills. Surely he alone is the all-knowing, all-wise. My Lord, you have surely granted me authority and taught me the interpretation of dreams, originator of the heavens and the earth. You are my guardian in this world and the hereafter. Allow me to die as one who submits and join me with the righteous." Also, forgetting is a much bigger deal in the Quran. Satan adds emphasis and theme, not just a story transition. So if you read the Bible, the fact that he forgets is just casually mentioned. Yet the head cup carrier did not remember Joseph, he forgot him. That's it. In the Quran, it's linked to Satan forgetting him. But Satan made him forget. And this is actually a theme of the Quran. So it actually adds emphasis. There's a bigger deal in the Quran. It's powerful. For example, 1863 also mentions, "I forgot the fish, and none made me forget it except Satan. And if Satan should cause you to forget, Satan has overcome them and made them forget the remembrance of Allah." So it's tied back to the idea that Satan makes you forget things and ultimately makes you forget the remembrance of God. The Quran has come to remind you of God. Right? So, for example, Abraham is telling his people, "My Lord encompasses all these things, all things, and knowledge. Will you then not remember?" Allah mentions the Quran, sought by the Quran containing reminders. So Satan tries to make you forget these things and forget God. Quran makes you remind. So the Quran makes you emphasize that forgetting is from Satan. These types of things, when you forget them, that's from Satan, and God is reminding you of these things, right? These types of forgettings are from Satan, and God is reminding you. But it's not as powerful. It's not made a big deal in the Bible. But one thing that is interesting in the Bible is it is mentioned that he did not remember Joseph, he forgot him. So it's mentioned twice. And interestingly, in the Quran, فَأَنْسَاهُ الشَّيْطَانُ ذِكْرَ رَبِّهِ. So Satan made him forget the remembrance of his Lord. So the mention to his master, he's translated, but Satan made him forget the mention to his master. So it's also mentioned twice. So Satan made him forget. It could have just said that. It could have just said that, but it said the mention of to his master. So it added this part. And zikr actually means remembrance. It actually goes back to remembrance in Arabic. So here it means mention. It means mention. That's what it means. But because it's coming from the same root word as remember and this and that. Over here it was minhu maskurni in the Arabic. Mention me before your master. So here when it says zikra Rabbi, the mention of his master, it goes back to the remembrance part. And so he forgot. Satan made him forget the remembrance to his Lord. And just like in Genesis, he did not remember Joseph, he forgot him. Right? And here the idea, the zikr, is sort of like a hint to the idea of remembrance as well. Right? In fact, if I pull up a different translation, right? Okay, so they've translated it the same way. So here's saying, "Mention me to your master," but Satan made him forget the mention to his master. Made him forget one part, but then zikr also reminds you of remembrance because it means here, for example, صاد والقرآن ذي الذكر والقرآن ذي الذكر, containing zikr, reminder. So zikr is the word for reminder in Arabic, and so when it says zikr, it sort of reminds you, sort of hints to reminder. So just like made him forget, the sort of a hint to reminder, just like that in the Bible, you had it mentioned twice as well. Did not remember Joseph, could have just ended there, but then it added, he forgot him. The Quran, twice as well. Right? Also, there's the fact that in both stories, Pharaoh/the king realizes it's a dream versus "I've not seen the dream," meaning he saw it vividly. So there's emphasis made on the fact that the dream was seen vividly. So in the biblical story, he sees this dream and it's very vivid and this and that. And then he says, then Pharaoh awoke and saw that it was a dream. So he realized it was a dream because when he was in the dream, he was so convinced that it was real, right? So there's this idea that it's a very vivid dream. Quran, that's hinted to as well. وَقَالَ الْمَلِكُ إِنِّي أَرَى سَبْعَ بَقَرَاتٍ, etc., etc. And the king said, "I have seen 7 fat cows." And then he explains the dream. So this idea of "I have seen," he didn't say "I dreamt," he said "I saw." I saw 7 fat cows and this and that, and it's implied that it's a dream in the fact that, of course, this stuff didn't happen for real. He didn't actually see 7 cows and this and that. But the language says, but in the language, he actually literally says, "I saw this," instead of saying, "I dreamt this." I saw this. So the Quran also hints to the fact that it was a very vivid dream. And the Bible also hints to the fact that it was a very vivid dream because the Pharaoh realized in the Quran, the king sees it. He's talking about as if he's seen it because it's so clear. Also, the reaction to the bag. So you'll find this ties back to a Christian tradition, or it's preserved within a Christian tradition. So it's mentioned here in this Christian tradition, which is in Greek. The brothers said to Joseph, "Father, why do you groan? Behold, the joy we have found in the bags, the cost of the grains. Stop wailing." In the Quran, then when they opened the baggage, they found their stock in trade had been returned to them. They said, "Oh, our father, what can we desire? What more can we desire? This is our stock in trade that has been returned to us. So we shall get more food for our family. We shall take care of our brother, and at the same time, add a full camel's load. At the same time, add at the same time a full camel's load of grain to our provisions. There's but a small quantity." So this tradition, not in the Bible, but in the Quran, and notice it's in Greek. So how did the Prophet know this story? In Greek. So now you have knowledge of the Greek stuff as well, and we're actually going to see some more interaction with this as well below. The next thing I'll mention is both stories emphasize that the knowledge of dreams are from God. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, "Not by myself, God will give Pharaoh an answer. Do not the meanings of dreams belong to God?" So remember how before I was talking about how God is absent later on in the story? Well, that's absent in like the narrative. He's not brought up in the narrative, even though beforehand the Lord is always brought up in the narrative, but he is in the dialogue. In the Quran, but sorry, I'm just mentioning that to clarify in case you're confused. But the point is, Joseph is tying back the knowledge of dreams to God, and the Quran does the same thing. Right? So, I will inform you of its interpretation before it comes to you. That is from what my Lord has taught me, talking about the interpretation of dreams. Here, Jacob says to Joseph that your Lord will teach you the interpretation of narratives. Or at the end, you taught me the interpretation of dreams, of narratives. Right? Tying back all this to God, and it could be that the reason this is being done is to emphasize to the Egyptians that this is not like one of your superstitions. This is actually coming directly from God. So you don't think Joseph is a superstition or something like that. No, this is different. It's dreams, and dreams go back to God. Also, we have the fact that the brothers of Joseph are called by that. They're called by the brothers of Joseph, whereas usually in the Bible you're called by your father. So they should be called the sons of Israel, but mostly in the Bible they're called the brothers of Joseph. So here you see 10 of Joseph's brothers, Benjamin with his brothers, and Joseph's brothers. And Joseph saw his brothers. So Joseph's, them being used by this phrase, Joseph's brothers, is found throughout the Bible as well. Even though they are called sons of Israel, so the sons of Israel, they are called that, but usually it's Joseph's brothers. That's the term used. And that's quite different for the Bible. Usually it will go by the authorship made through the father. The Quran does the same thing. Certainly were there in Joseph and his brothers signs for those who ask. And the brothers of Joseph came. إخوة Yusuf. And the brothers of Joseph came. Right? Also, there's this idea of not entering from multiple gates. This is mentioned in the Quran, but it's not in Genesis. It's actually in Genesis Rabbah. The Midrash interpreted Genesis 42 to mean that Jacob told his sons that they were all strong and brotherly. They were not to enter through one gate and all stand in the same place so that they should not tempt the evil eye. This story is found in the Quran as well. And when they entered from their father had ordered them, or actually, this is the first verse. And he said, "O my sons, do not enter from one gate, but enter from different gates, and I cannot avail you against the decree of Allah at all. The decision is only for Allah. Upon Him have I relied, and upon Him let those who would rely indeed rely." The commentators explained evil eye is being talked about, but that's from the commentators. And when they entered from where their father had ordered them, it would not avail them against Allah at all, except a need that the soul, a concern within the soul of Jacob, which he satisfied, and indeed he was a possessor of knowledge because of what we had taught him. But most of the people do not know. So the same story here, and it's not in Genesis. Notice, not in Genesis. There's another thing from Jewish tradition that, and the other one we found was from Christian tradition, Greek. Here's another thing in Jewish tradition we find in the Quran. How did the Prophet know this? Remember, the Jews in the beginning are testing the Prophet by saying, "Okay, ask him about the story of Joseph and brothers if he's a true prophet." The Quran responds by not only knowing the Genesis narrative, but the others as well. So, also, evil eye is mentioned in Genesis Rabbah, but omitted in the Quran, because the theme of the Quranic story and goals are different when it comes to patience and reliance on God in the face of hardship. This is what is being highlighted in these passages. That is where the emphasis is in these ayat. In details and bigger things, it's always about relying on Allah. So we find Jacob is always relying on God, even when it comes to small things, and also when it comes to like the big problems of life. There is interaction with Genesis, but also these extra traditions. That cements the reason for revelation, which was touching the Prophet. Also, the Quran uses them for its own themes and lessons. The Quranic account is more about extracting lessons than a long, detailed narrative. Everything is teaching you something. The important things are being highlighted, yet it's long enough to show you the author knows what they're talking about. This surah was also revealed in the year of sorrow. So, the Quran omits the mention to evil eye because that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is the lessons, and the point of the story is trust in God, and you should trust in God no matter whatever, a small thing or big thing and everything. Yeah? Also, so this story is revealed in the time of sorrow, and we find that reflected in the Quran as well. So there are these verses of sadness and this and that in the Quran. So this is one of the themes that the Joseph story is playing on as well, right? So just Jacob is sad. Other your souls have enticed you to something, so patience is most fitting, and Allah is the one sought for help against that which you described. Then later, your souls have enticed you to something, so patience is most fitting. Perhaps Allah will bring them to me altogether. Indeed, He is the knowing, the wise. He turned away from them and said, "Oh, my sorrow over Joseph," and his eyes became wet from grief. But he was of that, meaning of his grief as a suppressor. They said, "By Allah, you will not cease remembering Joseph until you become fatally ill or become of those who perish." He said, "I only complain of my suffering and my grief to Allah, and I know from Allah that which you do not know. Oh, my sons, go and find out about Joseph and his brothers and despair not of relief from Allah. Indeed, no one despairs of relief from Allah except the disbelieving people." Also, we find that Joseph in the Quran is a lot more open about his faith, and that fits in with the goals of the Quran. So, in the Bible, he actually pretends to be of the Joseph said to them, "Don't you know that a man like me can find out things like this by divination?" So divination, of course, being a reference to superstition and this and that, not allowed in Abraham's religion. So he makes them think, he's like that. But in the Quran, to his brothers, he's pretty clear he's a monotheist, and he believes in God, and he's not a or whatever he said. I seek the refuge of Allah that we take him, except with whom we found our possession. Indeed, we would be unjust. So he's clear to his brothers. He believes in God alone. So that fits in with the goals of the Quran. Why? Because the Quran is all about pure monotheism, believing in God, not being shy of believing in God, worshipping God alone, and all these things. And so, and also about hating this idea of associating partners with God and whatnot. So you wouldn't do paganism and this and that, even when you were trying to trick someone. So it fits in the Quran. Also, in the Quran, he doesn't reveal his feelings. There's no rant. No rant. In fact, he keeps his feelings within himself, and there's a double emphasis on this. So they at one point accuse him of stealing. They accused that at some point Joseph had stolen in the past. This was a slander, and so it says, "But Joseph kept it within himself and did not reveal it to them. He said, 'You are worse in position, and Allah is most knowing of what you describe.'" So meaning he kept this saying within himself and did not reveal it to them. So check out, there's a double emphasis here. So not only does Allah say he kept it within himself, but he also says and did not reveal it to him. وَلَمْ يُبْدِهَا لَهُمْ, did not reveal it to him. So it's mentioned twice. So there's a double emphasis on this fact that he doesn't reveal his feelings. But in Jewish-Christian tradition, he does. Genesis Rabbah, the brothers mention Rachel stealing, and Joseph retorts, "Is there a goat here I can slaughter? Are there brothers here who try to sell their brothers into slavery?" In fact, in Christian tradition, Joseph goes on a rant mentioning Jacob against Jacob. So I guess a rant against Jacob. This is according to Saqib Hussein, who's a scholar in all this. Whereas in the Quran, there's no rant against Jacob. Rather, it's the complete opposite, right? In fact, he's looking forward to looking up to his forefathers and this and that. "And I have followed the religion of my fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Notice Jacob. "And look how grateful he is. And it was not for us to associate anything with Allah. That is from the favor of Allah upon us and upon the people. But most of the people are not grateful." So there's no complaining, there's no, whining and this and that in the Quran. Rather, there's gratefulness, and all the time Joseph is always grateful. Always mentions the good things God does, and he does not mention that he was done wrong or anything like that. On to people and this and that too. So in the Bible, Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been very difficult, few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers." Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. So, by the way, this blessing part, remember I was telling you how this story in Genesis sort of playing out the promise that the Israelites will bless the nations, right? The seed of Abraham will bless the nations. This is beginning to play out now. But also, notice again, Jacob complains about his difficult years, but in the Quran, he keeps it to himself and between God and him. So this is Jacob speaking. He replied, "I complain of my anguish and sorrow only to Allah, and I know from Allah what you do not know." So there you go. Also, notice this subtlety in the Quran. So in Genesis, I believe this is Genesis, but I'll double check and put it or clarify in the next video. It's made clear that Benjamin is at least the brothers think of Benjamin as another favorite son of Jacob, and that Jacob really loves him and cannot live without him. And they call him an old. They mention that he's an old man, he's an old father, and this and that. Right. So we have an old father, and there is a child of his old age, the youngest. His full brother is dead, so that he alone is left of his mother, and his father dotes on him. Then it says the boy cannot leave his father. If he were to leave him, his father would die. And in the Quran, notice, and they appealed, "O chief minister, he is a very old father, so take one of us instead. We surely see you as one of the good doers." So here they are basically appealing. So basically what's happening is Benjamin, who's the brother here, the same brother as here, has been seized by the authorities of Egypt, and they're not letting him go, and they're basically saying, "Okay, why don't you take one of us and punish us instead of punishing Benjamin?" So clearly there's this idea of at least them seeing Benjamin as very important to Jacob and this and that. That's sort of reflected and hinted to, or reflected, I would say, actually, not just hinted to, but reflected in the Quranic story. Also notice how here they're talking about how we have an old father and this and that, and here they say he has a very old father, so even the language similar. Next up, let's read this interesting thread. One of the differences between the Quranic and a biblical account is that in the Quran, Jacob is a lot more self-aware of what the brothers are about to do compared to the Old Testament. For example, in the Old Testament, Jacob is the one who asked Joseph to go with his brothers, even though they were jealous of him and hated him and thought about killing him later. Genesis 37:13. When they had been gone for some time, Jacob said to Joseph, "Your brothers are pasturing the sheep at Shechem. Get ready and I will send you to them." "I'm ready to go," Joseph replied. While in the Quran, Jacob is very well aware of the jealousy his sons had against Joseph. That's why Jacob is very protective of his beloved son Joseph, and his sons had to persuade him to send Joseph with them. Quran 12:11. They said, "O our father, why do you not trust us with Joseph, although we are truly to him well-wishers?" 2. Not only do we see Jacob has more awareness in the Quran, but more importantly, he's the perfect role model for the patient believer who always has hope in God, and it's completely the opposite in the Old Testament. The Old Testament shows that Jacob believed the lies of his sons after they planned against Joseph, and then we see the desperation of Jacob after he believed them, even without questioning. Genesis 37:32-34. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured it." Devoured him. Jacob has surely been torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. While in the Quran, Jacob had a suspicion about his sons, and even after what happened, he never gave up on God, and he was a patient servant of God. Quran 12:7-18. They cried, "Our father, we went racing and left Joseph with our belongings, and a wolf devoured him. But you will not believe us, no matter how truthful we are." and they brought his shirt stained with fool's blood. He responded, "No, your souls must have tempted you to do something evil. So I can only endure this with beautiful patience. It is Allah's help that I seek to bear your claims." So look at this ungratefulness. Jacob tearing his clothes and this and that. This is wrong. This is showing ungratefulness to God. Whereas remember I showed you Jacob is a lot more patient in the Quran. The Old Testament shows the hopelessness of Jacob. Genesis 42:36. The father Jacob said to them, "You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you want me to take Benjamin. Everything is against me." Genesis 42:38. But Jacob said, "My son will not go down there with you. His brother is dead, and he is the only one left. If harm comes to him on the journey you are taking, you will bring my grey head down to the grave in sorrow." Well, again in the Quran, Jacob is a prophet who put his full trust in God, and he never gave up on God. And yet again, we take him as the perfect role model for patience and firmness. Quran 12:64. He responded, "Should I trust you with him as I once trusted you with his brother? But only Allah is the best protector, and he is the most merciful of the merciful." Later on, he says in the speech, "And upon Allah have I relied, and upon him shall those who rely rely." Quran 12:83, he cried, "No, your souls must have tempted you to do something. So I am left with nothing but beautiful patience. I trust Allah will return them to me. Surely, return them all to me. Surely He alone is the all-knowing, all-wise." And here he says, like, I hope, or perhaps Allah will return them to me. So he has hope. The Old Testament, once again, Genesis 44:29. "If you take this one from me too, and harm comes to him, you will bring my grey head down to the grave in misery." The Quran 12:83. When he finds out that, and then he suspects that the brothers have taken away Benjamin and this and that, when the brothers try and tell him that he stole and so he was detained in Egypt and whatnot. He says, he cried, "No, your souls must have tempted you to do something. So beautiful patience." So basically he resorts to beautiful patience. I trust Allah will return to them all to me, or perhaps Allah will return them all to me. So he has hope. Surely He alone is the all-knowing, all-wise. Then later he replied, "I complain of my anguish and sorrow only to Allah, and I know from Allah what you do not know. O my sons, go and search for Joseph and his brothers, and do not lose hope in the mercy of Allah, for no one loses hope in Allah's mercy except those with no faith." The Old Testament showed that Joseph forgot about his father and brothers while he was in Egypt, which shows he gave up on them and moved on. Genesis 41:51. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." Whilst the opposite in the Quran, Joseph always had faith he will reunite with his family and fulfill his visions because God had inspired him and gave him hope. Quran 12:15. And so when they took him away and decided to throw him into the bottom of the well, we inspired him. One day we'll remind them of this deed of theirs while they are unaware of who you are. And interestingly, you see, the thing is, Jacob in the Bible should be expecting the reuniting because he saw the vision. So wouldn't that vision come to pass? Right? Especially Joseph is a prophet, so his dreams are revelation. So he should be expecting it to pass. And the Quranic Joseph is aware that it will happen at some point. There's many examples of this, but I'm going to move on to the second point. Okay. In the Old Testament, Joseph put the money given to him by his brothers back at them without them knowing until one of the brothers discovered it in Genesis 42:27-28. But when they stopped for the night and one of them opened his sack to get grain for his donkey, he found his money in the top of his sack. "Look," he exclaimed to his brothers, "my money has been returned. It's here in my sack." Then their hearts sank. Trembling, they said to each other, "What has God done to us? What has God done to us?" And then we see the brothers shocked and frightened again, as if they saw it for the first time. In Genesis 42:35, as they emptied out their sacks, there in each man's sack was the bag of money he had paid for the grain. The brothers and their father were terrified when they saw the bags of money. Okay. So remember how I talked about the Quranic version of this actually goes back to a Greek tradition, or an early tradition which was preserved in a Greek manuscript, in a Greek writing. So that shows that the Quran, just like it when it came to the women, the cutting of the hands thing, when it took that rabbinic that tradition and it placed it in its correct order, fixed it, corrected it, just like that. This time, it looks at the biblical account of what has happened, and the Quranic author knows it's false. Allah knows it's wrong because there's this big contradiction there. So instead, the correct version is told to us, and that correct version, interestingly, also survived in a Greek manuscript, which shows that the author must have had knowledge of that. So it's one thing to say he corrected it, but not only did he correct it, but also he had knowledge of this other tradition. So now that's like a double interesting thing. Not only is there being a correction, but the correct version is also one that was found somewhere else in Judeo-Christian tradition. So in this story, when the connections to the other traditions, actual biblical traditions, are being made, they're being corrected as well. That's quite interesting, right? So this full story is not in the Quran. And you would wonder, well, how come in the same chapter you have this contradiction in the Bible? Well, this is actually common in the Bible. Why? Because you had different sources from which the information is coming, and even things like the Jewish Study Bible admit this. So that's why, remember, in one of the intertextualities I mentioned the Ishmael age difference contradiction. So how old is he? And in the same chapter, you have him being a teenager, an adult actually, and then a baby at the same time. How do you get this big contradiction? Well, because they were getting it from different sources, and then they were just, the way the book was put together and this and that, but different authors, and then it was just compiled. So that's how you get contradictions like this. Or you don't get that in the Quran. In the Old Testament, we understand that Benjamin was a child or a little boy after reading Genesis 44:20-22. And we answered, we have an aged father, and there is a young son born to him in his old age. His brother is dead, and he is the only one of his mother's sons left, and his father loves him. And we said to my Lord, the boy cannot leave his father. If he leaves him, his father will die. Yet shortly after, we discovered that Benjamin had 10 kids in Genesis 46:21. So these are the names of the children. And again, we see none of these mistakes in the Quran. So if you go to Genesis 44:20, where he's called a young son, go to the dictionary, you find it's mentioned, it means small, young, unimportant. Small, young, unimportant. Small, especially a youth. Young, a youth. So this is actually hints to, maybe not necessarily, but it really certainly seems to indicate a child, right? Even here he's called the boy, right? Genesis, okay, so he's called, where is it? The boy, right? So that's the feeling we get when we read when we know the word is Khatan. That's the word used to describe him. And here you can see it's mentioned Genesis 44:20. This is the verse we're looking at. Genesis 44:20. Then again, in Genesis 44:22, the word that's used to describe him is Hanar. And that word as well, if we go to the dictionary, is a boy, lad, youth, retainer, babe, boy, child, damsel, lad, servant, young man. So the indication again is boy. Not necessarily, but you see the language clearly being used twice here of a child, meaning that's the main indication of the language. A boy from the age of infancy to adolescence, by implication a servant, also a girl, babe, boy, child, damsel, lad, servant, young man. Okay. Yet we don't see that contradiction in the Quran. They discovered the money for the first time with the father, so that there's no contradiction about how old Benjamin is. There's also no contradiction about the money. They don't discover it twice, they only discovered it once. And I told you, remember how this feeds back into this tradition. The brothers said to Joseph, Father, why do you groan? Behold, the jewel you found in the bags, the cost of grain, stopped wailing. Then when they opened the bags, they found their stock in trade had been returned to them. They said, Oh, our father, what more can we desire? And what not? So the Quran not only does it know the Genesis account, but it knows the Rabbinic traditions, and now it knows this tradition that was preserved in a Greek writing. So remember, the Jews were challenging Prophet Muhammad through the Arabs that ask him about Joseph and his brothers. No one knows that story except us here. So when the response comes, not only is there such a sophisticated structure and language in that chapter, but also you have interaction with Genesis and all these accounts and corrections and historical corrections and this and that. Right, so at some point it becomes ridiculous. So it's actually the biblical tradition that doesn't make sense here in the Quran, and knowing this tells the true story, which is preserved in our tradition. Also, in the Old Testament, in Genesis 47:11, it says the district of Ramses, and that's a major historical mistake because the event of Joseph happened during the rule of the Hyksos. So you find most scholars will date it to the Middle Kingdom period. I've discussed this in Intertextuality too, where I show you proofs why, when you look at the dates of the Bible and this and that, it has to be the Middle Kingdom and this and that. So there's a big mistake here. Ramses was in the New Kingdom. So there's a historical mistake. If you want to understand why, you can watch Intertextuality 2, the example, I believe, with the king to Pharaoh example, where I go into the details. The event of Joseph happened during the rule of Hyksos. They ruled around the 14th dynasty, yet the name Ramses first appeared way later during the 19th dynasty by Ramses I and later by his grandson Ramses II. One of the most puzzling things, and again you don't find that in the Quran. In fact, interestingly, the Quran at the time of, well, actually we'll see that in a second, so I'll mention that then. One of the most puzzling things about the Old Testament is the number of the children of Israel in Egypt. The Torah mentions the number of people from the children of Israel were 70 when they first came to Egypt in the time of Joseph, yet after 430 years, we are extremely generous with the number 430, they became millions. The first census of Israel after the Exodus numbered 603,550 men, yet over 20 years of age, who could go to war. This included none of the Levites, etc. So you can look these up. Who numbered 22,000, numbers 339. Again, I've gone into detail in this in Intertextuality 2, the part where it's like Exodus was a small group. Okay. It also excluded all females, old men, boys under 20 years of age, and men unable to bear arms. This record has caused some scholars to estimate the total number of the children of Israel to be over 2 million. The first city to reach 1 million inhabitants is Rome in 133 BC, yet the children of Israel beat them to it by reaching more than 2 million in Egypt from 70 people in 430 years. Keep in mind they were persecuted and their boys were killed. How many children does the woman from Israel has to give birth to in order to reach that number? Also, interestingly, in Deuteronomy, over and over again, they're called the smallest of nations. Yet here, they seem to be a pretty large nation. So there's a historical mistake here. Also a contradiction. It's both a historical mistake and a contradiction. And actually, this reason of 2 million people in the Exodus is why historians will say, well, it never happened. And actually, many historians say, well, perhaps a smaller Exodus happened. Like, there's no problem with that. In fact, many say, yeah, it's likely a smaller Exodus happened. And so they say, well, maybe it happened with others, and this and that. But the Quran sort of fixes this mistake. And that makes it clear that the Quranic events line up with the history. Right? So while in the Quran, not only do we see no indication of that ridiculous number, but we see a hint at their numbers and the fact that they weren't millions of people, but a small group of people. So they could be a couple of thousands, for example. Quran 26:52-54. And we inspired to Moses, travel by night with my slaves. Indeed, you will be pursued. Then Pharaoh sent among the city gatherers, saying, these are only a small band of people. How could the author of the Quran know about all this? And he knew about unknown historical information at that time, information that we recently discovered. So actually the Quran, by correcting this mistake, again, makes the Exodus account and Moses and all this fit in line with the historical accounts, because we actually have an inscription, and I again discussed this in I think in Intertextuality 2, we have an inscription in Israel after Ramses II, who was the pharaoh of the Exodus, which mentions Israel, and it mentions them in relation to the land of Canaan. So that's near the Holy Land and whatnot. So that shows you that Israel and this and that actually existed in ancient Egypt. But the reason that historians will doubt that and say, well, it doesn't matter, we can't use that as evidence that they were there, when, the problem is you have 2 million, this number of 2 million people in the Exodus and this and that. We have no evidence of that. They'll use that and say, therefore, the historical account never happened. But, perhaps it happened with a much smaller amount of people. But the Quran, by mentioning the fact that they were a small group of people, makes it in line with the historical evidence, and in fact, because of the inscription we found, actually the events seem to perfectly go along with history, right? So there's no longer a historical mistake, rather it goes in line. So the fact that we have an inscription actually indicates that it's more likely it happened just purely based on archaeological research than it not happening, right? Just if we look at it from a historical standpoint. And we even disregard the idea of revelation and whatnot. Next up, we see in the Quran, the king in the time of Joseph had a dream, and because Joseph could interpret the dream, he asked Joseph for its interpretation. Quran 12:46. Joseph, O man of truth, explain to us about 7 fat cows eaten by 7 lean and 7 green spikes, and others dry, that I may return to the people. Perhaps they will know. Joseph said, basically it's Joseph, so he said, meaning Joseph, Joseph said, you will plant for 7 years consecutively, and what you harvest, leave in its spikes. So whatever you harvest, the crops you harvest, leave them in their spikes. Except a little from what you will eat. Then will come after that 7 difficult years, which will consume that you advanced for them, except a little from which you will store. A comparison which proves that storing wheat inside its spikes increases its storage lifespan. So Joseph in the Quran is giving them a very important advice to help them survive the 7 difficult years. Basically what this means is, in the Quran, Joseph advises them to store whatever they harvest in these spikes. Right, store grain in their spikes. Turns out that's actually a very good method. And Joseph's advice was very good. So here's a paper. It mentions storage in spike form had a positive effect on wet gluten content and hectoliter weight of wheat stored under non-optimal storage conditions. Amylase enzyme is better protected towards chemically breaking down in spike form. So it's better protected. Therefore, it is easily concluded that flour produced from wheat stored in spike form may be considered more beneficial for human health. As conclusion, it may be said that wheat stored in spike form is more tolerant than wheat stored in grain form to adverse storage conditions such as high moisture content and temperature and long-term storage. So this is a comparison of the functional characteristics of wheat stored as grain with wheat stored in spike form. So spike form seems to be good advice. It's especially interesting when you consider the fact that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he wasn't learned in agriculture. He didn't know much about these things. This was not his field. He was a 7th century man in Arabia, and he did not know much about agriculture and whatnot. Here's the hadith. It was narrated from Simak that he heard Musa bin Talha bin Ubaidullah narrating that his father said, I passed by some palm trees with the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he saw some people pollinating the trees. He said, what are these people doing? They said, they are taking something from the male part of the plant and putting it in the female part. He said, I do not think that this will do any good. News of that reached them, so they stopped doing it, and their yield declined. News of that reached the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he said, that was only my thought. If it will do any good, then do it. If it will do any good, then do it. I'm only a human being like you, and what I think may be right or wrong. But when I tell you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I will never tell lies about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And lies here is mentioned because basically he's saying that he's never going to say anything incorrect about Allah. And in fact, in Arabic, in that dialect, you could say someone lied when they simply got something wrong. So this was just a linguistic thing, right? I'm just mentioning that, just so you know, in case you're confused, right? Because if you read the context, that's clear as well, of course, right? He made a mistake. He had a thought in this that, and at the end of the day, he's just a human being like you and me. And so we don't have this sort of Christian conception of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You know, in Christendom, Jesus is God, and so he can never make any mistake. But in Islam, the Prophet cannot make a mistake when it comes to the religion. He's not going to tell you something wrong and make a inaccurate statement when it comes to God and this and that, because he's the messenger of God. So God, of course, protected him from making mistakes and this and that, because he has to perfectly pass on the religion. But when it comes to these other matters, he can make mistakes. He's just a human like you and me. You know, he ate food, he forgot, and this and that. And so when it comes to non-religious matters, he can make mistakes. And this is an example of when he made a mistake, when he had a wrong thought. And look how it's related to agriculture. So someone who didn't understand even this about agriculture, yet in the Quran we have this very interesting, neat idea of storing it in spikes. That's advanced agricultural knowledge. So that's very interesting when you consider who the Prophet himself was, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? And I will mention, by the way, that interestingly, Jesus in the Bible does say that the mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds. That's a scientific error, to be honest with you. And at the same time, you know, of course, I don't believe the Bible is authentic, so I'm not saying Jesus actually said that, but I'm just mentioning that for Christians out there. Even at that time, they had smaller seeds than the mustard seed there. But also, remember that we Muslims, we believe in Jesus, we believe in the Messiah, the Prophet, we love him and whatnot. We just don't say he was God or the Son of God and whatnot. Okay, so now let's go to sort of the conclusion. Now remember, again, the Bible had not been translated yet into Arabic, right? Remember, the Prophet couldn't read or write. Remember, many of these texts were untranslated lost texts in different areas and whatnot, right? Mention everything from the Bible to the extra biblical material are all traditions. None of them are all truth. They all have truth and falsehood in them. Mention the fact that the Prophet was sincere, so I'll give you another proof of that. The sun eclipsed in the lifetime of Allah's messenger on the day when his son Ibrahim died. So the people said that the sun had eclipsed because of the death of Ibrahim. Allah's messenger said the sun and moon do not eclipse because of the death or life of someone. When you see the eclipse, pray and invoke Allah. So notice how if he was a false prophet, he would have said, look, this miracle happened for me. He didn't even have to make it up. The people were already saying it about him, but he didn't take that opportunity because he was not a liar. He was sincere. He was a false prophet. He would have said, look, miracle happened because of me. My son died. Look what God did. But he didn't do that. He was a teller of truth. Here's another example. The hunger of the Prophet. So look, if he was in there for worldly gain, and he could have taken advantage of his the fact that he was the leader of Medina and this and that, and taken the money and been rich and this and that, but he wasn't. Ibn Abbas reported the Messenger of Allah, peace and blessings be upon him, would spend several nights in a row with an empty stomach, and his family would not find anything for dinner. Most of their bread was made from barley. I saw the Messenger of Allah, peace and blessings be upon him, while he was praying. His chest made a sound like a boiling water pot from his crying. The crying in prayer and spending hours in prayer, is this someone who is sincere? It looks so. Would a sincere person pretend to make up stories and be a prophet of God and this and that? No, he would not. So with that in mind, let's talk about the fact that he was not crazy. We know he was not crazy. He was a military leader and this and that. He had correct prophecies and whatnot. Also, people would have noticed he was being taught. Hadith are extremely detailed. We even know how many hair on his beard, white hair specifically. Also, Suleiman Dost, an Orientalist, mentions the Medina Hadith are so detailed and so many that they're like a diary of Muhammad's life. So if someone was teaching it, people would have noticed. None of the Arabs knew this story. Even the Quran mentions this. That's an evidence they don't know it, because the Quran was being recited out in public. If the Arabs did know it, they would have said, hold on, we know these stories. And the Quran would have been refuted, no one would have been Muslim. Imagine I go into a school who knows, everyone pretty much knows the stories of the Bible, at least the basic outlines. I'm like, you guys had no idea about who Jesus and Moses and whatnot was. I'm telling you about these things. That sounds ridiculous, and no one would believe you if you said that. The fact that the Quran mentions that, and the fact that it was recited out loud and so everyone believed in it at the end of the day, that shows you that these claims are true. And of course, all of the Quran is true. Still, people will say he studied. That's what I'm sure many of you disbelievers will say. So Allah says, وَكَذَلِكَ نُصَرِّفُ الْآيَاتِ وَلِيَقُولُوا دَرَسْتَ وَلِنُبَيِّنَهُ لِقَوْمٍ يَعْلَمُونَ. And thus do we diversify the signs so they will say you have studied, and so we may make it clear for people who know. Meaning he, the Prophet, has studied. You is a reference to the Prophet, that they're saying to the Prophet, you have studied. In fact, remember how they could not, when the Arabs tried to say someone was teaching him, they could only point to a slave who didn't even speak Arabic. So how would he teach the Prophet? So that shows you there weren't any Jews and Christians around to teach him, or rabbis or scholars and whatnot, right? Allah tells us about the idolaters who slandered when they claimed that this Quran, which Muhammad had recited for them, was actually taught to him by a human. They refer to a foreigner who lived among them as the slave of some of the clans of Quraysh, and who used to sell goods by as-safar. So notice how they have to go to a foreigner, they have to accuse a foreigner, because they didn't know the stories. So they knew he must be, if he's not getting it from God, he's getting it from a foreigner. Maybe the Messenger of Allah used to sit with him sometimes and talk to him a little, but he was a foreigner who did not know much Arabic, only enough simple phrases to answer questions when he had to. So in refutation to their claims of fabrication, Allah says, لسان الذي يلهدون إليه أعجمي وهذا لسان عربي مبين. The tongue of the man they refer to is foreign, while this is in a clear Arabic tongue. Meaning, how could it be that this Quran, with its eloquent style and perfect meanings, which is more perfect than any book revealed to any previously sent prophet, so it's a very eloquent book as well. And if you've seen my videos on that, you know that, the videos I posted on that. How could this have been learned from a foreigner who hardly speaks the language? No one with the slightest amount of common sense would say such a thing. And remember, no one. How would he even teach the prophet if he didn't speak Arabic? How would he teach it? Right. Also, so with that in mind, remember the Bible had not been translated, as Sidney H. Griffith, who's an Orientalist, confirms, after the rise of Islam and the Quran's appearance as a scripture in its own right. After that, remember this, after the rise of Islam and the Quran's appearance as a scripture in its own right, Jews and Christians translated the Hebrew Bible and the Greek New Testament into Arabic for their own use. So it's after. Also, the Talmud translated in 2012. This is why traditionally Islamic scholars have historically not referred to the Talmud. So anyway, look how almost all the stories were actually revealed in Mecca, and this was also a story revealed in Mecca where there were no Jews and Christians to teach. So the point is here, we're looking at intertextuality between the Quran and Judeo-Christian traditions, biblical and extra-biblical, how the Quran has intimate knowledge of these Hebrew, Greek, Syriac texts, many of which were untranslated and in different areas, yet the Quran will reference or respond to them. The author of the Quran clearly knew these texts and languages, yet Muhammad couldn't read or write, nor could the Arabs as a whole. In fact, the Arabs were unfamiliar with even the basic biblical stories. This proves Islam, especially when you put it together with the other things we know about Islam and the Quran and Muhammad, like the Quran's literary miracle, the prophecies of Muhammad, the historical miracles of the Quran, the biblical, of which there are a few, the biblical prophecies of Muhammad, the message of Islam, and it being far superior to every other religion, the miraculous expansion of Islam, other things like the organization in the Quran and whatnot. And remember, this episode was unique in that we were sort of looking at some of the more subtle interactions, some of the more interactions at a much deeper level. In far more of the details of a text, right? Sort of looking at the interactions between the literary features of a text. So how does the Genesis sort of tell the story? How does it tell it from a literary point of view? How does it use how does it fit into the rest of the context of Genesis? How does it use literary devices and this and that? Well, how does the Quran play on that? How does the Quran play on Genesis telling of the story? So we find many interactions, even when we go down and look at this microscopic deep level, if even the linguistics of a text in the Quran interacting with the linguistics of another text. Remember, we found many other examples, so we saw more straight up examples as well. Some example, the examples we've covered beforehand have been in your face. So we've seen, for example, these were the ones in the video 1, so many of them. Video 2, video 3, so many of these obvious examples. So we've seen those types of examples where it's within the details of the text, some interesting things which are being responded to. We've seen interaction with the stories that are both that are mentioned in the Judeo-Christian texts and in the Quran, how the Quran interacts with the stories, how the Quran interacts with the interpretations of stories and dogma and theologies and beliefs and this and that, how the Quran interacts with you know sort of the interpretations of these stories in terms of and how they were flooding and going around and what people how people were reading them. I think I just mentioned that, right? Interpretations. Um, and how people are reading into them. So stories, specific examples, historically how the Quran interacts with them, as in correcting them from a historical point of view, correcting them in terms of correcting the mistakes within the Bible and this and that. How about correcting the historical mistakes? I just mentioned that. How about the linguistic ones? So we saw, even in this one, we saw a new linguistic connection, right? Haita being also in Hebrew the same phrase, and many scholars mentioning how this was a foreign thing belonging to Aramaic, and we find it's in the Hebrew Bible as well. So interaction with the language, the actual Hebrew interactions, interaction with the stories, interaction with the details of the text, like certain interesting ideas that are buried some places in Talmud and other writings, the Quran then responds to them. And then interaction with the stories and interaction with the interpretations. And now what we've seen is interaction with the deep linguistic features of a text and how a story is told in the Bible, and how the Quran picks up on how the story is told, and how the Quran even picks up like and continues certain traditions of certain rhetorical and linguistic styles and features being used in a text. In the biblical text, and how the Quran will then continue those traditions, a couple of them. And then we also saw some comparisons, some differences. Well, how the Quranic author, who we now know has deep insight. By this time, we've seen 50 plus examples. I mean, we've done 48 officially, but within them we saw so many more. And so what we have done is we've established the Quranic author is very familiar with these texts. So now we can see how the Quran interacts with a even more micro level at these linguistic features. It's very interesting. It's very interesting interaction. So now we've seen a whole different dimension of interaction with the Judeo-Christian texts. So not only is there interaction with the deep, interesting things mentioned in the details of a text, but also the stories, the interpretations, the historical ones, fixing the contradictions, and now the linguistic features, and also interacting with the language as well, like interlinguistic puns and whatnot. So, and also now we just saw interacting with how a story is told. So, deep interaction. That's the point, and that shows you a scholar, not just a scholar, a very learned scholar who knows Greek, a scholar of Greek, a Hebrew, and he knows, he's familiar with the Syriac as well. He's very learned in the Greek and especially the Hebrew, and he's very learned or he's learned in the Syriac traditions as well, and he interacts with them, and he's learned in how people interpret this. And when you remember all that we remembered about the Prophet being sincere and unlettered, meaning he couldn't read or write, and the Arabs not even knowing the stories. Remember, the Jews and Christians, the Jews were actually testing the Prophet to see if he's a true prophet by seeing if he knows the story, and how the Quran will sort of fix these stories. Remember how it fixed the women cutting story, how it fixed the contradictions, the other contradictions we mentioned in the Joseph story. Very deep knowledge the Quran has, and notice how the Quran doesn't copy down the mistakes. We saw many contradictions in the Bible. And we saw a historical contradiction, historical mistakes here in the Joseph story as well. Quran does not copy those mistakes. Even, for example, why call the leader of at Moses' time Pharaoh? If you're saying calling the leader of Egypt at the time of Joseph king was just a lucky thing, he got it, just guessed it, and he got it right. Well, why didn't he also call the leader at the time of Moses king? Rather, he called him Pharaoh, because the author knows at the time of Moses it was Pharaoh, and before that it was king. So the Quran knows that, and that's why it uses both terms and both in the correct historical place. So what did he, somehow learn Muhammad learn all these languages and sort of figure all this out and become this big scholar, and at the same time he had a time machine, and so he's correcting the historical mistakes, and he's correcting the contradictions and blah blah. He's traveling to different places, getting all these different. Doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense. And so right, I think I'll leave it there.